Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I'm 50 years old now, and the memories of what happened in those mountains still wake me in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, and reaching for a weapon that's no longer there. I've been experiencing things that most people would dismiss as impossible since I was 11 or 12, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what stalked me during that winter in the Manzano Rocky Mountains. The year was 2005, and I had just turned 38. After my divorce, I needed solitude, somewhere far from civilization where I could rebuild my shattered life. The log cabin I found seemed perfect. A kit house with cap and tongue-and-groove construction, nestled at the very edge of Cibola National Forest, just outside Albuquerque. The isolation was exactly what I craved, or so I thought. The house itself was a study in contrasts. One side of the roof bore traditional asphalt shingles, weathered gray from years of mountain storms. The other side featured heavy cement tiles, installed by the previous owner for reasons I never understood. Those tiles would prove significant in ways I couldn't imagine. My black lab, Rex, had made the journey with me, a 100-pound companion whose presence provided the only comfort in that desolate place. The real estate agent had warned me about the winters. Gets down to 2 degrees from November through April, she'd said with practiced indifference. 4 feet of snow minimum. You sure you want something this remote? I had nodded confidently, believing my city-softened sensibilities could handle whatever nature threw at me. I was wrong about many things that year. When the first snows came in late October, I understood the agent's warnings were understated. The white blanket that descended wasn't the gentle dusting I'd expected. It was a suffocating shroud that transformed the landscape into something alien and hostile. I bought a yardstick from the hardware store in town, thinking it would be adequate to measure the accumulation. The first time I tried to use it, the entire stick vanished into the white expanse without touching bottom. I remember kneeling in that clearing behind the house, turning my head sideways and plunging my entire arm into the snow just to retrieve that simple measuring tool. The cold bit through my jacket sleeve instantly, numbing my fingers as I groped blindly in the frozen depths. This wasn't even a drift, just the natural accumulation in an open space. The realization of how thoroughly winter had claimed this place settled over me like a funeral shroud. Rex adapted better than I did. His thick coat and natural instincts served him well, but even he seemed subdued by the overwhelming whiteness and the strange quality of sound that snow brings. That muffled, dead quality that makes every noise seem both distant and unnaturally close. During those first weeks, I told myself the adjustment period was normal. The isolation was what I wanted. The bitter cold was just another challenge to overcome. But as November deepened into December, something changed in the rhythm of our mountain existence. Rex began behaving differently. His ears would prick up at sounds I couldn't hear. His hackles would rise for no apparent reason. And he started refusing to go outside after dark. I attributed it to the harsh conditions until the night I first heard it. The sound came just after midnight on a particularly brutal December evening, when the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. I was reading by the fireplace. Rex curled at my feet when something massive struck the roof above us. The entire house shuddered as if hit by a falling tree, but I knew no tree could make that specific sound, the scraping, grinding noise of claws finding purchase on cement tiles. Rex's reaction was immediate and terrifying. He bolted upright, every muscle in his body rigid, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, tracking something I couldn't see but could definitely hear. The footsteps, if you could call them that, moved across the roof with deliberate slowness. Each impact sent vibrations through the wooden structure, causing dishes to rattle in the kitchen cabinets and the floorboards beneath my feet to creak in response. I reached for the .41 Magnum I kept on the side table. The weight of the revolver in my hands provided some comfort, though I questioned what good it would do against something that could shake a solid log house with its footsteps. The .41 Magnum isn't a common caliber, more powerful than a .357 but more manageable than a .4, but I'd chosen it specifically for situations where stopping power mattered more than convenience. The scratching sounds intensified as whatever was up there adjusted its position. I could hear individual claws clicking against the cement tiles, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard magnified tenfold. Rex whimpered and pressed himself against my legs, his usual confidence completely shattered. We sat there in frozen silence for what felt like hours, listening to the thing above us settle into some kind of resting position. When it finally stopped moving, the silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. Over the following weeks, a horrible routine established itself. The creature, I had no other word for it, would arrive sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning. Always the same thunderous landing. Always the same deliberate movement across the roof. Always the same eventual settling into stillness that would last until just before dawn. I began keeping a journal, documenting each visitation with the obsessive detail of someone whose sanity was slowly fraying. Entry after entry recorded the same terrifying sequence. The initial impact that never failed to jar me awake. The systematic traverse of the roof from one end to the other, and the final positioning directly above my bedroom. That last detail haunted me more than anything else. Whatever this thing was, it knew where I slept. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. I tried staying awake, sitting in the living room with the Magnum in my lap and Rex pressed against my side. But even when I was conscious and waiting for it, the arrival never failed to spike my heart rate and flood my system with adrenaline. The house's wooden frame would groan under the weight, and I began to worry about structural damage. More than that, I worried about the day when the roof might finally give way. My friend Carl visited during this period, a skeptical man who'd known me for 15 years and had never heard me tell a lie. When I described what was happening, he laughed outright. Mountain fever, he called it, claiming the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. He carried a .25 caliber pistol, more for show than protection, and made jokes about my imaginary monster throughout his first evening there. The laughter died in his throat at 2:17 a.m. when the thing made its presence known. Carl went from ridicule to terror in the space of a single footfall, his hand flying to his small pistol as the house shook around us. His face went white as he listened to the systematic traversal of the roof, the scraping of claws on cement, the sheer impossible weight of whatever was moving above us. When it finally settled into position, Carl turned to me with wide, frightened eyes and whispered, "What the hell is that thing?" The most terrifying encounter happened on a night in January, when I decided to step outside for a cigarette despite the sub-zero temperature. The deck stretched 50 feet along the back of the house, a substantial platform that had seemed like a luxury when I first moved in. Now it felt like a trap, an exposed platform where I was vulnerable to whatever lived in the surrounding darkness. I'd been outside for maybe 5 minutes, my breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air, when I heard the sound that still gives me nightmares. Something massive landed on the far end of the deck with enough force to make the entire structure bounce. The wooden planks groaned under the impact, and I could hear the support beams creaking in protest. What happened next defied everything I thought I knew about size and movement. The thing, whatever it was, crossed the entire 50-foot length of the deck in 4 steps. 4. I'm 6 feet tall and weigh 220 pounds, and even if I took the longest strides possible, I couldn't cover 50 feet in fewer than 15 or 20 steps. This creature took 4 casual steps and covered the distance as if the deck were a coffee table. I stood frozen in absolute terror, the cigarette forgotten and burning down between my fingers. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic, and far too large for anything that should exist on this mountain. The creature was close enough that I should have been able to see it, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. Rex was inside, throwing himself against the glass door in a frenzy of barking and clawing, desperate to either get to me or get me inside. My hand found the Magnum's grip, but I didn't draw it. Some primitive instinct warned me that any sudden movement would end badly, so I stood there motionless while something impossibly large breathed in the darkness just beyond my vision. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it move away. Not the thunderous footsteps from before, but a different sound, like something flowing through the trees with unnatural grace. Following the deck encounter, the creature's behavior changed in ways that suggested a disturbing level of intelligence. No longer content to simply traverse the roof and settle down, it began what I can only describe as stalking behavior. It would move to different positions throughout the night, always staying above whichever room I occupied. If I tried to sleep in the guest bedroom, it would relocate there within minutes. When I moved to the living room, the sounds would follow. It was as if the thing was tracking my exact location through the roof, adjusting its position to maintain some kind of surveillance. The thought that it might be watching me, studying me, made my skin crawl with a fear so intense it was almost physically painful. I stopped sleeping entirely during this period, surviving on coffee and raw determination while Rex grew increasingly agitated. My dog had always been protective, but now he seemed to exist in a constant state of alert, ears perpetually pricked, hackles raised, eyes darting between me and the ceiling. He refused his food more often than not, and I could see him losing weight. The stress was killing both of us slowly. The sounds grew more varied and complex. In addition to the heavy footsteps and claw scratches, I began hearing what sounded like sniffing, deep investigative inhalations that seemed to be testing the air around the house. Sometimes I would hear tapping, as if the creature were using a claw to probe specific areas of the roof, testing for weak spots or entry points. One particularly horrifying night, I heard scratching directly above the fireplace chimney. The metal flue began to vibrate, and soot rained down into the cold ashes below. I grabbed the magnum and aimed it at the ceiling, my finger trembling on the trigger. The scratching stopped abruptly, as if the thing had sensed my readiness to fire. The silence that followed was pregnant with malevolent intelligence. By February, my mental state was deteriorating rapidly. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, and the growing certainty that something was hunting me had pushed me to the edge of a complete breakdown. I found myself talking to Rex for hours, discussing strategies for dealing with our tormentor, as if he could understand and respond. In my more lucid moments, I recognized this as a dangerous sign, but lucidity was becoming increasingly rare. I began making preparations for a confrontation I both dreaded and desired. The waiting was destroying me more thoroughly than any physical attack could. I researched the 41 Magnum's capabilities extensively, calculating bullet trajectories through various roofing materials, and wondering if 210-grain rounds would be sufficient to stop something that could shake a house with its footsteps. The ceiling above my bedroom showed increasing signs of stress. Hairline cracks appeared in the plaster, and one beam had developed a slight but noticeable sag. I reinforced it with a steel post, but the gesture felt futile. If this thing wanted to come through the roof, I doubted anything I could do would stop it. Carl returned for a second visit in late February, bringing with him a larger caliber weapon and a grim determination to help me solve the problem. We sat up together that night, both armed and ready for confrontation. When the creature arrived, punctual as always, Carl raised his pistol toward the ceiling, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "We should shoot it," he whispered through gritted teeth as the thing moved directly overhead. "Put it down before it decides to come through." I stopped him with a firm hand on his arm. "What if the roof slows the bullet down too much?" I asked. "What if we just wound it and make it angry?" The thought that had haunted me for months spilled out in that moment of shared terror. If we damaged this creature but didn't kill it, if we merely enraged something that already demonstrated such size and intelligence, what would it do to us? The image of it tearing through the weakened roof, reaching down with claws the size of railroad spikes, grabbing us like toys. That vision had kept me from pulling the trigger on dozens of occasions. Carl lowered his weapon, understanding the horrible logic. We sat in terrified silence while the thing above us moved with increasing agitation, as if it sensed our hostile intent and was responding with its own mounting aggression. The final encounter came on a night in early March when the winter's grip was just beginning to loosen. I was packing. The decision to leave had crystallized over the previous weeks as my situation became untenable. Rex was already exhibiting signs of severe psychological stress, and I wasn't far behind. Whatever was stalking us had won through sheer persistence and the gradual erosion of our sanity. The creature arrived earlier that night, while I was still conscious and moving around the house. This time, however, it didn't follow its usual pattern. Instead of settling into a watching position, it began moving erratically across the roof, covering the same areas repeatedly in what seemed like agitated pacing. The scratching sounds intensified, and I could hear sections of cement tile being displaced and crashing to the snow below. Rex began whimpering continuously, a sound of pure animal terror that cut through me like a knife. I gathered him into my arms, feeling his heart racing against my chest as the chaos above us reached a crescendo. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to understand that its prey was preparing to escape, and it wasn't pleased with this development. The house shook more violently than ever before, and I heard the horrifying sound of wood beginning to splinter. The beam I'd reinforced was groaning under impossible stress, and I realized that our time had run out. The creature was no longer content to watch and wait. It was preparing to come through. I grabbed my emergency bag and Rex, abandoned everything else, and ran for my truck. The engine turned over on the third try, and I gunned it down the snow-packed driveway without looking back. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark silhouetted against the sky above my former home, but the details remain mercifully unclear in my memory. I drove straight through the night, putting 300 miles between myself and that cursed mountain before I finally stopped. Rex never fully recovered from the experience. He remained nervous and skittish for the rest of his life, always watching the sky with wary eyes. I never returned to collect my belongings. I never filed an insurance claim. I never spoke to anyone official about what happened in those mountains. Some experiences are too far outside normal human understanding to be believed, and some truths are too dangerous to share. But I still wake up sometimes in the dead of night, listening for the sound of claws on roof tiles, wondering if whatever stalked me in that isolated cabin is still out there, patient and hungry, waiting for the next fool who thinks they want to live alone in the wilderness. God help anyone who finds themselves in that position. The mountains keep their secrets well, but some secrets are better left undiscovered. To this day, I cannot sleep in any house with a cement tile roof. The sound triggers memories I've spent years trying to bury. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still and the darkness seems especially thick, I swear I can still hear it, that deliberate, measured pacing of something large and predatory, searching for prey in the endless night. Summer camp at Pinewood had always been my escape from the suffocating routine of suburban life. At 17, I thought I knew what fear was: the anxiety of final exams, the terror of asking someone to prom, the dread of college applications looming ahead. But that was before the summer of 2017, before I met Cassandra, and before the night that would forever change how I understood the fragility of the human mind. Cassandra was unlike any girl I'd encountered in my sheltered high school existence. She carried herself with the swagger of someone who'd seen more of life's darker corners than most kids our age. Her black hair was always pulled back in a severe ponytail, and she wore her camp-issued t-shirts like armor, sleeves rolled up to reveal intricate scars along her forearms. Not self-inflicted, she'd later tell me, but remnants of a house fire when she was 12. She never backed down from anything or anyone, whether it was climbing the highest tree during our outdoor adventures or staring down the camp bullies who thought they could intimidate the new kids. What I respected most about Cassandra was her brutal honesty. She didn't sugarcoat anything, didn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. When other campers complained about the lumpy mattresses or the questionable cafeteria food, Cassandra would just shrug and say she'd slept in worse places, eaten worse things. There was a hardness to her that intrigued me, a shell that seemed impenetrable. Our cabin, Cedar Lodge, housed 12 campers and 2 counselors. The building itself was ancient by camp standards, constructed in the 1960s with rough-hewn logs and a metal roof that amplified every raindrop into a thunderous drumbeat. The smell of decades of teenage occupancy lingered in the walls, a mixture of bug spray, sunscreen, dirty laundry, and something else I could never quite identify, perhaps fear itself, accumulated over countless summers of homesick children and whispered ghost stories. My bunk was directly across from Cassandra's, with our mutual friend Diego occupying the bed between us. The proximity meant I had a front row seat to observe her nightly rituals, which I found oddly comforting in their consistency. Every single night, without fail, she would arrange a small LED lantern on the windowsill beside her bed, check the batteries twice, and keep it burning until morning. When Diego jokingly asked her about it the first week, she'd simply said she liked to read late into the night, but I noticed she never had a book in her hands after lights out, just her eyes fixed on that steady glow as if it were the only thing standing between her and something terrible. The weather that July had been unsettled, with afternoon thunderstorms rolling through the mountains with increasing frequency and intensity. The camp staff tried to maintain their cheerful demeanor, but I caught glimpses of concern in their hushed conversations during mealtimes. The local news had been reporting unusual atmospheric pressure readings, and there were whispers among the older counselors about previous summers when severe weather had forced early evacuations. By the third week, even Cassandra seemed on edge. Her usual bravado was replaced by a hyper-vigilant watchfulness, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. She'd started positioning herself with her back to walls during group activities, and I noticed her flinch whenever someone approached her from behind. Diego and I exchanged concerned glances but didn't press her for explanations. We'd learned that Cassandra shared information on her own terms, never under pressure. The signs were building towards something catastrophic, though none of us recognized them at the time. The birds had grown silent during the day, no longer providing their usual soundtrack of chirps and calls. Even the insects seemed subdued, their normal evening chorus reduced to an occasional cricket or the distant buzz of a mosquito. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down on the camp like a physical weight that made breathing laborious and thinking difficult. The morning of July 23rd dawned with an oppressive stillness that made everyone uncomfortable. The sky was an odd shade of green-gray that I'd never seen before, and the humidity was so thick it felt like walking through warm cotton. During breakfast, the camp director, Ms. Rodriguez, announced that all outdoor activities would be canceled for the day due to severe weather warnings. We were to remain in our cabins or the main lodge until further notice. I spent the morning writing letters home, something I'd been putting off for weeks. As I described the camp's activities and my new friendships, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I was documenting something that was about to end. Not just the camp session, but something more fundamental. The sensation was so strong that I actually dated the letter for the following day, as if I knew that after tonight time would be measured differently. Cassandra spent the morning obsessively checking and rechecking her small backpack, the one she never let out of her sight. I'd always assumed it contained the usual teenage contraband, cigarettes, candy, maybe some photos from home, but watching her count and recount whatever was inside, her lips moving silently as she cataloged each item, I realized the bag contained something much more significant. Emergency supplies, perhaps, or mementos from whatever trauma had shaped her into the guarded person she'd become. Diego tried to lighten the mood by organizing card games and sharing stories from his childhood in Phoenix. But even his infectious laugh couldn't penetrate the atmosphere of growing dread that seemed to be settling over our cabin like a fog. The younger campers were becoming increasingly restless, their usual chatter replaced by nervous giggles and darting glances toward the windows. Our counselors, Tanya and Mike, both college sophomores who usually radiated confident authority, were checking their phones constantly and speaking in low, urgent tones whenever they thought we weren't listening. By early afternoon, the first radio broadcast began filtering through the camp's communication system. Tornado watches had been upgraded to warnings for our entire county. The National Weather Service was tracking a supercell thunderstorm that had already spawned multiple tornadoes as it moved eastward through the mountains. Expected arrival time, sunset. The camp's emergency protocols swung into action with military precision. All campers were to return to their cabins immediately after dinner, which would be served early. We were to remain in our bunks with flashlights and battery-powered radios until the all-clear was given. No one was to leave the cabins for any reason without direct authorization from the camp director. The swimming pool, recreational buildings, and outdoor areas were declared off-limits until morning. As we filed into the dining hall for what would be our last normal meal together, I caught sight of Cassandra's face in profile. Her jaw was clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles working beneath her skin, and her eyes had taken on a 1,000-yard stare that reminded me of war veterans in documentaries. She barely touched her food, instead spending the meal slowly rotating her water glass in perfect circles, the ice cubes creating a rhythmic clinking that somehow seemed ominous rather than soothing. The storm's arrival became audible during dessert, a low rumbling that started as barely perceptible vibration, and gradually built into a continuous growl of thunder rolling across the mountain peaks. Through the dining hall's large windows, we watched the forest bend and sway as wind gusts tested the strength of trees that had weathered decades of mountain storms. But this felt different, more violent and personal, as if nature itself had developed a malicious intent. The run from the dining hall to Cedar Lodge remains one of the most terrifying physical experiences of my life. What had been ominous rumbling just minutes earlier had exploded into a full-scale meteorological assault. The wind didn't just blow. It attacked, grabbing at our clothes and hair with what felt like malicious intent, trying to lift us off the ground and hurl us into the darkness. Rain struck like bullets, each drop hitting with enough force to sting exposed skin. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in the span of an hour. turning the warm summer evening into something that felt like late autumn. Lightning blazed across the sky in continuous sheets rather than individual bolts, creating a strobing effect that turned the familiar campgrounds into an alien landscape of stark shadows and blinding white illumination. I ran directly behind Cassandra, close enough to grab her if the wind tried to steal her away. Even through the chaos, I could see her technique. She moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd fled through dangerous territory before. Her backpack was clutched to her chest rather than worn normally, her head down to protect her face from the driving rain, her steps measured and purposeful despite the urgency of our situation. Diego stumbled twice during the 50-yard sprint, saved both times by the combined efforts of Cassandra and myself. His face was white with terror, his usual easy smile replaced by wide-eyed panic as he struggled to maintain his footing on the rain-slicked path. Behind us, other campers were crying, shouting instructions to each other, and generally adding to the chaos. But ahead of us, Cassandra moved like a ghost, silent and focused, as if she'd been preparing for this exact scenario her entire life. The cabin door slammed shut behind the last of our group with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, the familiar space had been transformed by the emergency lighting and the sounds of the storm battering the building from all sides. The metal roof amplified every raindrop into a percussion symphony that made conversation nearly impossible without shouting. Wind found every gap in the old log construction, creating whistling sounds that seemed almost musical in their variety and intensity. Tanya and Mike immediately began distributing flashlights and checking their radio for emergency broadcasts. The news was not reassuring. Multiple tornadoes had been confirmed on the ground, with at least 2 tracking directly toward our area. All residents of the county were advised to seek immediate shelter in interior rooms, away from windows, and to remain there until morning. The expected duration of the severe weather, 6 to 8 hours. As we settled into our bunks with our emergency supplies, I noticed Cassandra had positioned herself in the corner bed farthest from any windows, her back against the solid log wall. Her LED lantern was already burning, casting a small circle of warm light that seemed pathetically inadequate against the supernatural darkness pressing against the cabin's windows. She'd arranged her possessions with military precision. Flashlight within easy reach, backpack contents apparently inventoried and ready for rapid deployment, shoes positioned for immediate use. The storm continued to intensify throughout the early evening hours. Tree branches began striking the roof and walls with increasing frequency, each impact sending vibrations through the entire structure. The electrical power failed around 9 o'clock, plunging us into a world illuminated only by scattered flashlight beams and Cassandra's unwavering lantern. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, a black so complete it seemed solid, pressing against the glass like something alive trying to force its way inside. The power failure changed everything. What had been merely frightening became genuinely terrifying as our modern securities were stripped away one by one. The electric lights that had provided psychological comfort vanished. The heater that had been fighting the unseasonable cold fell silent. Even the small sounds of electrical systems, the hum of refrigerators, the whisper of air circulation. Diego had managed to fall asleep around 10 o'clock, his natural optimism apparently extending to his ability to find rest even in crisis. His steady breathing provided a counterpoint to the chaos outside, a reminder that normal human existence was still possible even as the world seemed intent on destroying itself. I envied his peace, but sleep felt impossible with the storm raging and Cassandra sitting rigid in her bunk, staring at shadows that seemed to move independently of our flashlight beams. Tanya and Mike had positioned themselves near the radio, taking turns monitoring emergency broadcasts and trying to maintain some semblance of authority in a situation that had clearly exceeded their training. Their voices carried undertones of barely controlled panic as they relayed updates. More tornadoes confirmed, power outages across 3 counties, emergency crews unable to respond until the storm passed. We were truly on our own until dawn. Around midnight, the storm reached what I hoped was its peak intensity. The sound of wind through the trees had evolved from a roar into something more primal, a keening wail that seemed to contain voices, as if the storm itself were screaming in agony or rage. Tree falls became frequent enough that we stopped flinching at each crash, the sounds blending into a continuous soundtrack of destruction. Through brief gaps in the storm's fury, we could hear similar sounds from the direction of other cabins. Shouts, crying, the occasional crash of breaking glass or splintering wood. Cassandra had not moved from her position in over an hour. She sat cross-legged on her bunk, back straight against the wall, eyes fixed on the darkest corner of the cabin where the shadows seemed deepest. Her lantern created a small pool of sanity around her, but beyond its reach the darkness writhed and shifted with each lightning flash, creating the illusion of movement where there should be none. I found myself watching the same corner, trying to understand what held her attention so completely. The temperature inside the cabin continued to drop as cold air found every gap in our shelter's defenses. Our breath began to form small clouds in the flashlight beams, and several of the younger campers had wrapped themselves in every blanket they could find. The cold was more than physical discomfort. It carried a psychological weight that made thinking difficult and hope seem like a naive luxury we could no longer afford. As the storm raged on, I became aware of a change in its character. The random violence of wind and rain was gradually being replaced by something that felt more organized, more purposeful. The sounds began to take on patterns. Not quite rhythmic, but structured in a way that suggested intelligence behind the chaos. Lightning strikes started to feel coordinated rather than random, illuminating specific areas of our surroundings, as if something were deliberately searching for weaknesses in our defenses. It was during one of these lightning flashes that I first saw what Cassandra had been watching. In the corner where the shadows gathered most thickly, the darkness seemed to have gained substance. Instead of simply being the absence of light, it appeared to have weight and texture, pressing against the walls and ceiling like smoke trapped in an invisible container. The sight lasted only for the duration of the lightning flash, but it was enough to make me understand why Cassandra had been staring with such intensity. The realization that we were being observed came gradually, like a poisonous thought seeping through the barriers of rational denial. What had seemed like tricks of light and shadow began to reveal themselves as something far more sinister. Shapes that moved with purpose rather than randomness. Darkness that seemed to watch and evaluate rather than simply exist. Cassandra spoke for the first time in hours, her voice barely audible above the storm but carrying clearly in the unnatural stillness that had settled over our immediate area. "Do you see them too?" she asked, not turning her head from her vigil over the corner. Her question wasn't directed at anyone specific, but I knew she meant me. She'd noticed my growing awareness of whatever presence had taken residence in our cabin. I wanted to deny it, to rationalize away what my eyes were reporting. But the darkness in that corner was moving with too much intention to be dismissed as imagination. It flowed and shifted like liquid, but maintained a coherence that suggested structure beneath its fluid surface. Occasionally I caught glimpses of what might have been limbs or a head, but the shapes dissolved the moment I tried to focus on them directly. "See what?" Diego mumbled from his bunk, finally awakening as the storm's intensity began to fluctuate rather than maintaining its previous steady assault. His question carried genuine confusion. Apparently, whatever was manifesting in our cabin was selective about its visibility. Tanya and Mike continued their radio monitoring without any sign of awareness, their flashlight beams passing through the corner without revealing anything unusual to their eyes. Cassandra finally turned to look at me, and I saw something in her expression that made my stomach clench with fear. It wasn't terror. She was too controlled for that. Instead, her face carried the resigned acceptance of someone confronting a familiar enemy. "They follow me," she said simply. "They always have since the fire. I thought maybe here, with all these people around, they'd leave me alone, but storms make them stronger." The fire she mentioned, the one that had left scars on her arms, suddenly took on new significance. I'd assumed it was a tragic accident, the kind of random disaster that occasionally destroys families and leaves survivors struggling to rebuild. But the way she spoke about them suggested something more complex, more personal. These weren't random supernatural entities drawn by tragedy. They were specifically connected to Cassandra, following her like predators that had selected their prey and were waiting for the right moment to strike. As if responding to her acknowledgement, the darkness in the corner began to move more aggressively. What had been subtle shifting became obvious manipulation of space and shadow. The temperature around us dropped another 10 degrees, and our breath began to form not just visible clouds but actual crystals that tinkled to the floor like broken glass. The sound of the storm outside seemed to recede, replaced by something that might have been breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that came from everywhere and nowhere. Diego sat up on his bunk, finally fully awake and alert. "Guys, what's happening? It's getting really cold, and I swear I can hear..." He trailed off as his flashlight beam swept across the corner, and for a moment, just long enough for all three of us to see clearly. The darkness took on a definite shape. Not human, but not entirely alien either. It was tall enough that it had to hunch to fit beneath the cabin's sloped ceiling, and its proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. Where eyes should have been, there were points of dim red light that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the illumination from our flashlights. The sight lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the thing retreated deeper into shadow, but it was enough to shatter Diego's composure completely. He began to hyperventilate, his flashlight shaking so violently that its beam created a strobe effect across the cabin walls. "What was that?" he gasped. "What the hell was that thing?" Cassandra moved with practiced efficiency, pulling a small bottle from her backpack and forcing Diego to drink whatever it contained. His panic attacks subsided within minutes, replaced by a glassy-eyed calm that suggested she'd given him something stronger than water. "Sedative," she explained when I shot her a questioning look. "My doctor prescribed it for emergencies. He's better off unconscious right now." With Diego safely medicated and our counselors still obliviously monitoring their radio, Cassandra and I were left alone to confront whatever had taken residence in our cabin. The thing in the corner seemed to sense the reduction in witnesses and began to manifest more boldly. The red points of light that served as its eyes grew brighter, and I could make out more details of its impossible anatomy. Limbs that bent in too many places, fingers that extended far beyond normal proportions, a face that seemed to shift between human and something else entirely. "It feeds on fear," Cassandra explained in the matter-of-fact tone she used for discussing camp activities or meal schedules. "The more terrified you are, the more solid it becomes. That's why I keep the light burning, not because I'm afraid of the dark, but because I need to see them coming. You can't fight something you can't see." The knowledge that our fear was literally fueling the entity's manifestation created a vicious cycle. Trying not to be afraid of something actively threatening you is like trying not to think of a white elephant. The very effort creates the opposite result. I could feel my terror feeding the thing, watching it grow more substantial with each racing heartbeat, each drop of cold sweat that trickled down my spine. The storm outside had evolved into something beyond meteorological explanation. The wind now carried voices. Not quite human, but close enough to be disturbing. They seemed to be calling names, though not names I recognized. The voices carried emotions too complex for simple sound. Longing, hunger, and something that might have been loneliness so profound it had curdled into malevolence. As the thing in the corner continued to solidify, other phenomena began manifesting throughout the cabin. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The temperature variations became extreme, patches of freezing cold alternating with areas that felt like they were heated by invisible fires. Our flashlight beams began to bend and distort, creating impossible angles that hurt to look at directly. Most disturbing of all were the changes in our counselors. While they remained unaware of the primary manifestation, they were clearly being affected by whatever presence had invaded our space. Their radio conversations became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to people in places that made no sense. Tanya began speaking to empty air, carrying on detailed conversations with invisible companions. Mike started laughing at random intervals, not the normal laughter of someone trying to maintain morale, but the hollow sound of someone whose grip on reality was slipping. "They're being influenced too," Cassandra observed. "It's not just about seeing the entities directly. They create fields of disturbance that affect everyone nearby. That's what happened to my family during the fire. Not everyone could see what I saw, but everyone felt the effects." The mention of her family raised questions I didn't dare ask. How many people had been affected? How many had survived? And why had Cassandra been spared when others presumably hadn't been so fortunate? But there was no time for personal history. The thing in the corner was becoming more active, testing the boundaries of our small circle of lantern light like a predator probing for weaknesses in its prey's defenses. Around 3 in the morning, the entity made its first direct attempt to communicate. The voices from the storm outside suddenly unified into a single clear sound that bypassed our ears entirely and spoke directly to our minds. It didn't use words. Language was too crude a tool for the concepts it wanted to convey. Instead, it transmitted pure meaning, flooding our consciousness with images and sensations that no human vocabulary could adequately describe. The message was simple in its horror. We were not the first group it had encountered, and we would not be the last. It had been feeding on human fear for longer than our civilization had existed. following catastrophes and disasters like a scavenger drawn to carrion. The storm was not a natural phenomenon but a hunting ground it had created, a controlled environment where it could corner its prey and feast without interruption. The entity's revelation that it had been orchestrating events rather than simply taking advantage of them transformed our situation from bad to hopeless. We weren't just victims of circumstance caught in a natural disaster. We were prey that had been deliberately herded into a trap. Every aspect of our current predicament, from the storm's unusual intensity to our isolation in the cabin, had been engineered to create optimal feeding conditions. Cassandra seemed less surprised by this information than I was, suggesting she'd encountered similar situations before. "The fire at my house wasn't an electrical accident," she said quietly, finally sharing the story she'd kept hidden since our friendship began. "It started the same way, a storm that came out of nowhere, power failures, and then they appeared. My parents and younger brother couldn't see them directly, but they felt the effects. Dad started drinking heavily. Mom became paranoid and wouldn't let us leave the house, and my brother developed night terrors so severe he had to be hospitalized." She paused to check on Diego, who was still unconscious but breathing steadily. The sedative had been a mercy. Whatever psychological torment he would have endured while conscious was beyond what any 17-year-old should have to experience. "The fire started in my room," she continued. "I was watching them move around, trying to figure out what they wanted, when one of them reached out and touched the curtains. They just ignited. Not like normal fire. This burned cold and spread faster than anything natural could." The implications of her story were staggering. These entities weren't just passive observers or even simple predators. They were actively malevolent, capable of manipulating physical reality to cause maximum psychological and physical damage to their victims. The fact that Cassandra had survived such an encounter made her either incredibly lucky or incredibly strong. Given what I'd observed of her character, I suspected it was the latter. Our current situation was deteriorating rapidly. The thing in the corner had grown substantial enough to cast its own shadow, creating a recursive loop of darkness within darkness that hurt to contemplate. Its breathing sounds had become unmistakably organic, no longer the ambiguous whispers they'd started as, but clearly biological processes occurring in something that definitely possessed lungs and a respiratory system. The voices in the storm were multiplying as well, suggesting that other entities were being drawn to our location like moths to a flame. What had started as a single presence was becoming a congregation, with each new arrival adding to the oppressive atmosphere that was making thought increasingly difficult. The air itself seemed thick with malevolent intelligence, pressing down on us like a physical weight that threatened to crush whatever sanity we had left. Our counselors had deteriorated to the point where they were no longer reliable sources of help or information. Tanya was now completely engaged in conversations with invisible companions, her side of the dialogue suggesting she was being given detailed instructions about activities that made no logical sense. Mike had stopped monitoring the radio entirely, and was instead drawing elaborate diagrams on scraps of paper, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. "We need to last until sunrise," Cassandra said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "They're creatures of storm and darkness. When the sun comes up and the weather clears, they'll retreat to wherever they came from. But we have to survive the next 3 hours without letting them feed enough to become fully materialized." 3 hours. It sounded like nothing under normal circumstances. The length of a movie. A single class period, a short nap. But with terror distorting our perception of time, and every minute feeling like an hour, it might as well have been an eternity. The entity in the corner seemed to sense our desperation and began moving more aggressively, testing the boundaries of Cassandra's lantern light like a wolf probing for gaps in a campfire's protection. The physical manifestations were becoming impossible to ignore. Scratching sounds came from inside the walls, as if something were trying to claw its way through the logs from the outside. The floor began to vibrate in rhythmic patterns that felt like a massive heartbeat coming from beneath the cabin. Most disturbing of all, the shadows cast by our own bodies started to move independently, reaching toward the corner where the primary entity waited with a patience that felt infinite. The final hour before sunrise tested every limit of human endurance. The entities had multiplied to the point where the entire cabin felt saturated with hostile presence. Every corner held watchers, every shadow concealed movement, and the air itself seemed alive with malevolent intelligence. The temperature had dropped to the point where our breath formed not just clouds but actual ice crystals, creating a constant tinkling sound as frozen exhalations fell to the floor. Cassandra's lantern, which had been our sole reliable source of protection, began to flicker as its battery approached exhaustion. Each dimming of the light brought the surrounding darkness closer, and I could see panic beginning to crack her controlled facade for the first time since I'd known her. "I don't have spare batteries," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the sounds of supernatural activity that now filled every corner of our shelter. The scratching in the walls had evolved into what sounded like construction activity, as if multiple entities were working to dismantle our cabin from the inside out. Boards creaked and groaned under pressures that had nothing to do with wind or weather. Through gaps that hadn't existed before, cold air flowed in streams that felt directed and purposeful rather than random. We were being systematically exposed, our defenses stripped away piece by piece. Diego remained unconscious, which continued to be a blessing rather than a curse. His face had taken on an expression of peaceful oblivion that I envied deeply. Whatever dreams the sedative had given him were surely preferable to our waking nightmare. Tanya and Mike had progressed beyond mere psychological influence to what appeared to be complete possession or control. Their movements had become synchronized in ways that normal humans don't move, and when they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers rather than individuals. The primary entity in the corner had grown large enough to require the entire vertical space of the cabin, its impossible proportions folded and twisted to accommodate the structural limitations of our shelter. The red lights that served as its eyes had multiplied, creating a constellation of malevolent attention that tracked our every movement. When it shifted position, the sound was like breaking bones amplified through a cathedral's acoustics. As Cassandra's lantern continued to dim, I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of trying to conserve the remaining battery power by reducing the light output, I cranked it to maximum brightness, creating one final burst of illumination that drove the shadows back to their furthest possible positions. The entities recoiled like vampires confronted with garlic, their forms becoming less substantial as the light blazed through our small space. "When it dies," I told Cassandra, "we run for the main lodge. Whatever happens, don't stop moving until we're in a room with other people and electric lights." She nodded grimly, understanding that our window of opportunity would last only as long as it took the entities to realize their prey was attempting to escape. The lantern's death was not gradual. One moment it blazed with final desperation, and the next it flickered out completely, plunging us into a darkness so complete it felt solid. But instead of the expected assault from surrounding entities, we were greeted by something else entirely. The first gray traces of dawn filtering through the cabin's windows. The storm, which had raged with supernatural intensity throughout the night, was beginning to break apart as natural weather patterns reasserted themselves. The effect on our supernatural tormentors was immediate and dramatic. The scratching in the walls stopped abruptly. The temperature began to rise toward normal levels. Most importantly, the oppressive sense of hostile presence that had filled the cabin began to dissipate like morning fog touched by sunlight. The entities weren't destroyed. I could sense them retreating rather than dying, but they were clearly weakened by the approaching day. Cassandra and I didn't wait to see what happened next. We grabbed our essential belongings, checked that Diego was still breathing, and made our escape into the growing daylight. Storm had left the campgrounds transformed. Trees down everywhere, buildings damaged, the familiar landscape rearranged by wind and rain, but it all looked wonderfully, gloriously normal in the pale morning light. We found other survivors gathered in the main lodge, sharing stories of a night that had tested everyone's sanity. But as we compared experiences, it became clear that Cassandra and I had encountered something beyond what the others had faced. Their stories were of fear and discomfort, property damage and power outages. Only we spoke of entities and impossible manifestations, of darkness given substance and malevolence made manifest. Later investigation would reveal that our cabin had been built on the site of a previous structure that had burned in 1987. Claiming the lives of 3 campers during a similar summer storm. The official reports cited electrical failure and blocked exits, but local folklore spoke of supernatural influences and unexplained phenomena. The rebuilt cabin had been constructed with modern safety features and blessed by local clergy, but apparently some presences are too persistent to be deterred by human precautions. Cassandra never returned to camp after that summer, and she transferred to a different school district before our senior year began. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd continued to experience supernatural encounters, though she'd learned to manage them better as she matured. Diego recovered from his sedative-induced unconsciousness with no memory of the night's supernatural events, though he developed a lasting phobia of storms that persisted into adulthood. As for me, I've never experienced anything similar since that night at Pinewood Camp. Whether the entities were specifically drawn to Cassandra's presence, or whether I was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, I may never know. But I learned something valuable about the nature of fear and courage. Sometimes survival requires not the absence of terror, but the ability to function despite it. In the darkest hours before dawn, when the impossible becomes inevitable, and reality becomes negotiable, the only reliable defense is the light we carry within ourselves, and our determination to see another sunrise. The camp closed permanently the following winter, citing structural damage from the storm and declining enrollment. The official records make no mention of supernatural activity, but those of us who were there that night carry memories that no amount of official denial can erase. Some experiences transcend explanation, existing in the spaces between what we think we know about reality and what reality actually contains. In those spaces, on nights when storms rage and darkness feels alive with hostile intent, we learn that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep moving forward despite terror, to protect the light that separates civilization from chaos, and to believe that dawn will always come, no matter how long or dark the night may be. My name is Frank Anderson, and I am 72 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1998, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. It's a story I've kept mostly to myself for years, partly out of fear that no one would believe me, and partly because reliving it brings back a terror I've never quite shaken. But now, as I approach the twilight of my life, I feel compelled to share it, perhaps as a warning, or maybe just to unburden myself of a secret I've carried for far too long. Back then, I'd been a park ranger for about 5 years, stationed in the remote stretches of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It wasn't a job I'd ever imagined for myself, but life has a way of taking unexpected turns. I grew up in Pittsburgh, a city boy through and through. My father worked in the steel mills, and I was expected to follow in his footsteps. But I had different ideas. I was bright, ambitious, and determined to make something more of myself. I went to college, got a degree in business, and landed a job with a big accounting firm right out of school. For a while, it seemed like I was living the American dream. I married my college sweetheart, Sarah, bought a house in the suburbs, and started climbing the corporate ladder. But as the years went by, I found myself increasingly dissatisfied. The long hours, the constant pressure, the office politics, it all started to wear on me. Sarah and I grew apart, our conversations becoming shorter, our silences longer. It all came to a head one night in 1993. I came home late from work as usual to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, a packed suitcase by her feet. "I can't do this anymore, Frank," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm living with a stranger." The divorce was quick and relatively painless, at least in legal terms. Emotionally, it left me reeling. I threw myself into work, thinking it would help, but it only made things worse. 6 months later, I walked into my boss's office and quit. For a while, I drifted. I sold the house, bought a small cabin in the woods of Pennsylvania, and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. It was during one of my aimless hikes in the forest that I stumbled upon a help wanted sign at a ranger station. On a whim, I applied. To my surprise, they hired me. The job suited me in ways I never expected. The isolation that had initially attracted me soon became a source of peace. I liked being out in the woods, away from the noise and chaos of the city. The forest became my sanctuary, a place where the complexities of human relationships gave way to the simpler rhythms of nature. My job was peaceful for the most part. I spent my days patrolling the trails, assisting hikers and making sure the wildlife stayed wild. I learned the names of trees and plants, the habits of animals, the changing moods of the forest through the seasons. For the first time in years, I felt like I was where I belonged. But nature, I was about to learn, isn't always peaceful, and some things that dwell in the deep woods are beyond our understanding. It was late October of 1998 when it happened. I had just come off a 3-day break. which I'd spent at my small cabin, tucked away a good hour's drive from the nearest town. The leaves had turned, and the forest was a riot of reds and oranges. The air had that crisp, clean scent that only comes with autumn in the Northeast. That morning, I was out on a routine patrol, just making my rounds. I remember thinking how lucky I was to call this place my office. I was driving the old park truck, a beat-up Chevy with more miles than I cared to count, down a gravel road that led to one of the more isolated trails. The radio was playing softly, some classic rock station that faded in and out as I wound through the hills. I hummed along absently, my mind already on the day ahead. I had plans to check on a family of black bears I'd been monitoring. The cubs would be getting big now, nearly ready to den up for the winter. As I rounded a bend, something caught my eye. A figure standing by the side of the road, arm outstretched, waving me down. This wasn't completely unusual. Hikers got lost or turned around all the time, especially in the more remote areas of the park. Still, something about this scene made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed the truck, gravel crunching under the tires as I pulled over. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman. She looked to be in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was dressed in hiking gear, though her clothes looked a bit too new, like she'd just bought them for this trip. I rolled down the window, the cool autumn air rushing in. "Everything all right, miss?" I called out. The woman hurried over to the truck, her face etched with worry. There was a nervous edge to her voice as she spoke. "No, it's not. I need help. My friend, he went off the trail, and I can't find him. I'm worried something's happened. I've dealt with lost hikers before, but something about this woman's demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. She seemed genuinely frightened, not just concerned or embarrassed like most people who've wandered off course." "All right, ma'am. Try to stay calm," I said, reaching for my radio. "I'm going to call this in, and then we'll go look for your friend. What's your name?" "Lydia," she replied, wringing her hands. "Lydia Pearson. Please, we have to hurry. Don's been gone for hours." I nodded, keying the mic on my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Anderson. I've got a report of a missing hiker near the East Ridge Trail. I'm going to investigate. Over." The radio crackled with static before a voice came through. "Copy that, Ranger Anderson. Keep us posted. Over." I turned back to Lydia. "All right, hop in. We'll head to where you last saw your friend and start from there. Can you tell me more about what happened?" As Lydia climbed into the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be more than a routine search and rescue. Little did I know just how right that feeling would turn out to be. As we drove deeper into the forest, Lydia filled me in on the details. She and Don Martin, her boyfriend of 2 years, had come to the Allegheny National Forest for a weekend hiking trip. It was supposed to be a chance to reconnect, to rekindle their relationship after a rough patch. "Don's been working so much lately," Lydia said, her voice tight with worry. "This trip was my idea. I thought it would be good for us to get away from everything, you know?" I nodded, keeping my eyes on the rough gravel road. "How long have you two been out here?" "We arrived yesterday afternoon," she replied. "We set up camp near the East Ridge Trail and went for a short hike. Everything was fine then. This morning we started out early. Don wanted to take some photographs. He's really into nature photography. We were about 2 hours in when he saw something off the trail. He said he wanted to get a closer look." "And that's when he disappeared?" I asked. Lydia nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I told him not to go. The underbrush looked so thick, and we're not supposed to leave the trail, but he insisted. He said he'd only be gone for a few minutes." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "That was 4 hours ago. We pulled up to the trailhead, and I grabbed my gear, a flashlight, a map, a first aid kit, and a few other essentials. As we started down the trail, I radioed in our location to dispatch. The forest was thick here, the underbrush dense and unwelcoming. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We called out for Don as we pushed through the brush, our voices echoing unnaturally in the stillness. About half an hour into our search, we found a small clearing. That's where things started to get strange. There were signs of a struggle, broken branches, scuffed ground, but no sign of Don. I bent down, examining the ground, and noticed something odd. There were footprints, but they didn't look right. They were too large and oddly shaped, almost like a human's, but distorted. I stood up, trying to make sense of it. Lydia, did Don have any medical conditions? Could he have wandered off? No, nothing like that, she replied, her voice shaky. He's an experienced hiker. He wouldn't just get lost. As we stood there, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air felt heavier, and the usual sounds of wildlife were conspicuously absent. I've been in the woods long enough to trust my instincts, and something about this felt wrong. We decided to split up, hoping to cover more ground. I gave Lydia my flashlight and kept the radio. We agreed to meet back in the clearing in 20 minutes. I moved deeper into the forest, calling out Don's name. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Then I heard it, a rustling sound not far off. I turned and headed toward the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw next stopped me in my tracks. There, partially hidden behind a tree, was Don, but he wasn't moving. As I got closer, I realized why. Don was dead. His body was slumped against the tree, his eyes wide open in terror. There were deep gashes on his arms and chest, and his clothes were shredded. It looked like he'd been attacked by some wild animal, but the wounds didn't match any animal I knew of in these woods. I backed away, reaching for my radio. But before I could call it in, I heard a scream. Lydia. I turned and ran back towards the clearing, my mind racing. When I got there, I found Lydia on the ground, unconscious, and standing over her was something. It wasn't human. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with long limbs and a distorted face. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. It had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets, and its mouth was a gaping maw full of sharp teeth. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature turned to me, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then it moved, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I barely had time to react. I grabbed a branch and swung it at the creature, but it was like hitting a rock. The branch shattered, and the creature lunged at me. I dodged, grabbing Lydia and pulling her to her feet. We ran, the creature right behind us. My truck was our only hope. We stumbled through the forest, the creature's footsteps pounding behind us. I could hear its ragged breathing, feel its presence closing in. We burst out onto the gravel road, and I shoved Lydia into the truck before diving in myself. I started the engine and floored it, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before catching. The creature slammed into the side of the truck, leaving a dent, but we were already moving. I drove like a madman, my eyes on the road and the rearview mirror. The creature chased us for a while, but eventually it fell behind. I didn't stop until we reached the ranger station. What followed was a blur of questions, reports, and disbelief. I reported what had happened, though I left out the part about the creature. Who would believe me? Don's death was ruled as a bear attack, and Lydia and I were given some time off to recover. But I knew the truth. Something was out there, something that wasn't an animal. Lydia moved away not long after, too traumatized by what had happened to stay. I don't blame her. Sometimes I wish I could leave too, but something keeps me here. A sense of duty, perhaps, or maybe a need to understand what really happened that day. Over the next few months, I did some research. I found old stories, local legends about a creature called the Wendigo. It matched what I saw, but there were no records of it ever being real, just stories passed down through generations. Life went on, but I was changed. I became more cautious, always carrying a weapon on my patrols. I made sure to stay in constant contact with my team, and I never went back to that part of the forest alone. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. I still see that face when I close my eyes. The forest, once my sanctuary, now holds a darkness I can never fully shake. I don't tell this story to scare people. I tell it because it happened, and because I think it's important to remember that there are things out there we don't understand. The forest is a wild place, and it doesn't always follow the rules we expect. As for Don, his death was a tragedy, and I think about him often. He didn't deserve what happened to him. None of us did, but we can't change the past. We can only learn from it and try to stay safe. So if you ever find yourself in the Allegheny National Forest, or any forest for that matter, Remember this. Stay on the trails, keep your eyes and ears open, and never ever go looking for something you don't want to find. Because sometimes, in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, the things we fear most turn out to be all too real. My name is Walter Allen, and I am 78 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 12, 1998. I remember it like it was yesterday. My name is Walter Allen, and I am 78 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 12th. I remember it like it was yesterday. I had been working non-stop for months as a freelance writer, juggling deadlines and battling writer's block. The stress was getting to me, and I desperately needed a break. That's when I decided to take a solo camping trip in my RV. I had this old Winnebago that I'd bought secondhand a few years back. It wasn't much to look at, but it was reliable and comfortable enough for a weekend getaway. A friend of mine had told me about this secluded spot in the backwoods of Maine. He said it was peaceful, a good place to fish and relax. It sounded perfect. I packed up some supplies, loaded my golden retriever Cooper into the passenger seat, and hit the road early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but pleasant. As we left the city behind, the landscape gradually transformed. Concrete and steel gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. Cooper sat with his head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. His excitement was contagious, and I found myself grinning as we wound our way along the narrow country roads. It was late afternoon by the time we reached our destination. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the dense forest. I found a small clearing near a creek that looked perfect for setting up camp. I parked the RV, making sure it was level, and stepped out to survey the area. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. It was a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease almost immediately. I set up my little campsite with a folding chair, a small table, and a grill for cooking. Cooper explored the area, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed every tree and bush within reach. As I was arranging things, I noticed something odd. About 100 yards away, partially hidden by a cluster of trees, was an old pickup truck. The truck looked like it had seen better days. Its once red paint was now a patchwork of rust and faded color, and the tires seemed to be slowly sinking into the soft earth. It struck me as strange to see another vehicle out here, especially one that looked like it had been abandoned, but I shrugged it off, figuring it probably belonged to some old-timer who used the lake as his private fishing spot. With the campsite set up, I decided to try my luck at fishing. I grabbed my rod and tackle box and headed down to the creek, with Cooper trotting along beside me. The water was clear and cool, and I could see small fish darting about in the shallows. I found a comfortable spot on the bank and cast my line. As I sat there enjoying the peace and quiet, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. It was too quiet. There were no crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the creek. It should have been relaxing, but something about the silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After about an hour, with no luck on the fishing front, I packed up and headed back to the campsite. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. I lit a small campfire and set about cooking the dinner I had packed. Some hot dogs and beans. Simple camping fare, but it smelled delicious after a long day of driving and setting up camp. As I sat by the fire, eating my dinner and sharing some hot dog with Cooper, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The shadows cast by the fire seemed to dance at the edge of the clearing, creating moving shapes that my mind kept trying to turn into something sinister. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just my city-dweller brain unused to the deep quiet of the forest. After dinner, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight, though I didn't think I'd need it yet, and set off down a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. Cooper came with me, sticking close to my side as we ventured into the growing darkness. The forest was different at night. The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The path, which had seemed clear and inviting in the daylight, now felt like it was closing in around us. I walked for about half an hour, trying to enjoy the solitude, but that nagging feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a rustling in the bushes off to my left. At first, I thought it was just a deer, or maybe a rabbit. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stopped and listened, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Cooper's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just another rustle, this time from behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing but trees and undergrowth. Cooper was on high alert now, his body tense and ready to spring. "Come on, boy," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Let's head back." We started back down the path, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every few steps I'd hear another rustle or the snap of a twig, always just out of sight. I picked up the pace, nearly jogging by the time the campfire came back into view. Back at the campsite, I added more wood to the fire, building it up until the flames leaped high into the air. The extra light made me feel a little better, pushing back the darkness and whatever might be lurking within it. Cooper settled down next to my chair, but he remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the tree line. I tried to relax, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. I was a city boy after all, not used to the sounds and movements of the forest at night. But as I sat there staring into the fire, I couldn't help but feel that something was very wrong.
It must have been close to midnight when I heard it. A long, low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost human, but distorted somehow, filled with a pain or anguish that made my skin crawl.
Cooper jumped to his feet, barking furiously at the darkness beyond the fire's light. I stood up too, my heart pounding in my chest, and shone my flashlight out into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual, just the same trees and bushes that had been there all along. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "This is private property. You need to leave." There was no response, just another of those terrible moans. Closer this time. Cooper's barking grew more frantic, and he started to move towards the sound. I grabbed his collar, not wanting him to run off into the dark. "Inside, Cooper," I said, my voice shaking. "We're going inside." I quickly doused the fire and gathered up my things, all the while feeling like something was watching me from just beyond the reach of my flashlight. We retreated to the RV, and I locked the door behind us, drawing all the curtains tight. Inside the RV, I turned on every light I could, trying to create a safe bubble of illumination. Cooper paced restlessly, stopping every now and then to growl at the door. I sat at the small table, my flashlight and an old baseball bat I kept for protection close at hand. As the night wore on, the sounds outside grew stranger and more frequent. Sometimes it was that awful moaning, sometimes it was heavy footsteps circling the RV, and sometimes it was a light tapping, like someone, or something, was testing the walls for weakness. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept expecting to see a face appear at one of the windows, but there was never anything there when I looked. When dawn finally broke, it felt like I'd aged years in a single night. The forest outside was quiet now, the morning sun driving away whatever nightmares had stalked the darkness. I made a strong pot of coffee and sat looking out the window, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the light of day, it all seemed absurd. Had I really spent the entire night cowering in fear over some strange noises? I was a grown man, for heaven's sake, not some kid at summer camp telling ghost stories. I decided that I must have let my imagination run wild, fueled by too much solitude in an unfamiliar environment. Determined to salvage my weekend, I decided to spend the day exploring the area. I packed a small backpack with some essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and of course, my trusty flashlight. Cooper seemed eager to get out as well, his tail wagging as I hooked on his leash. As we set out, I noticed something odd. The old pickup truck I had seen the day before was gone. There were tire tracks leading away from where it had been parked, still fresh in the soft earth. It made me uneasy. Had someone been out here last night? Were they responsible for the strange noises? We hiked along the creek for a couple of hours, the exercise and fresh air helping to clear my head. Cooper enjoyed himself, splashing in the water and chasing after squirrels. We even found a small waterfall, the water cascading down moss-covered rocks into a clear pool below. As we sat by the waterfall, eating our packed lunch, I tried to rationalize the events of the previous night. Maybe it had been some local kids playing a prank. Or perhaps there were coyotes or other animals in the area that I wasn't familiar with. Anything seemed more plausible than some unknown creature stalking the woods. On our way back to the campsite, we passed by where the old truck had been. I stopped to examine the area more closely. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the mud, large ones, much bigger than my own, and they didn't look entirely human. The prints were elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe. They led from where the truck had been, circled around our campsite, and then disappeared into the dense underbrush. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Cooper whined softly, pressing against my leg. I hurried back to the RV, my mind racing. What had made those prints? Why had they been circling our camp? And most importantly, were they still out there? Once back at the campsite, I debated what to do. The rational part of my brain said to pack up and leave, to get back to the safety of civilization. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and unexplained phenomena, wanted to stay and figure out what was going on. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to stay one more night, but I took some precautions. I moved the RV to a more open area where it would be harder for anything to sneak up on us. I gathered extra firewood and built up a large fire, planning to keep it going all night. I also dug out an old camera I had brought along, thinking I might be able to capture evidence if anything strange happened again. As the sun began to set, I felt my nerves start to fray. Every sound from the forest seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. I kept the fire blazing and sat with my back to the RV, Cooper by my side and the baseball bat within easy reach. The early hours of the night passed uneventfully. I began to think that perhaps the previous night had been a fluke, that whatever had been out there had moved on. But then just after midnight it started again. It began with the moaning, that same horrible pain-filled sound I had heard the night before. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the trees. Cooper started barking, his hackles raised. I stood up, bat in hand, and scanned the darkness beyond the fire's light. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a large pine tree, was a figure. It was tall, much taller than a normal person, and seemed to be covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes caught the firelight and glowed an eerie yellow. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creature took a step forward, into the light, and I got my first clear look at it. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It walked on two legs, but its feet were elongated and ended in sharp claws, the source of those strange prints I had seen earlier. Its arms were long, nearly touching the ground, and its hands were more like paws, also tipped with vicious-looking claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was a twisted mix of human and animal features. The snout was elongated like a wolf's, but the eyes were disturbingly human-like, filled with an intelligence that seemed to bore right through me. I raised the bat, my hands shaking. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The creature tilted its head, almost as if it was curious. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out another of those bone-chilling moans. It took another step forward, and I could smell it now, a rank, musky odor that made my stomach turn. Cooper was going berserk, barking and growling, straining at his leash. I wanted to run, to jump in the RV and drive away as fast as I could, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The creature took another step, and another. It was at the edge of the fire's light now. I could see saliva dripping from its jaws, its claws flexing as if in anticipation. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But then something unexpected happened. A loud bang echoed through the clearing, like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped around, looking towards the source of the noise. There was another bang, and another. The creature let out a howl, not a moan this time, but a sound of pure animal rage, and then it turned and loped off into the darkness. I stood there, bat still raised, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. Cooper had stopped barking and was now whining softly, pressing against my leg. Then I heard footsteps approaching. I turned, ready to defend myself. But instead of another monster, I saw an old man emerge from the trees. He was carrying a shotgun and had a grim expression on his weathered face. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. The old man came closer, keeping his shotgun ready. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "These woods ain't safe, especially not at night." What was that thing?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man shook his head. "Best not to ask too many questions about that. Some things, a man's better off not knowing." He introduced himself as Frank. He lived in a cabin a few miles away and had been tracking the creature for years. He wouldn't tell me much about it, just that it had been in these woods for as long as anyone could remember, and that it was dangerous. Frank helped me pack up my things and followed me in his truck as I drove the RV out of the woods. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, a small place called Millfield. Frank took me to a diner there, bought me a cup of coffee, and told me to go home and forget what I'd seen. But how could I forget? That creature, whatever it was, had changed everything. The world I thought I knew, with its rules and logic, had been turned upside down in a single night. I drove home the next day, my mind still reeling from what had happened. I told a few friends about my experience, but most of them just laughed it off, saying I must have imagined it or that it was probably just a bear. But I know what I saw. In the years since, I've done a lot of research. I've looked into folklore and cryptozoology, trying to find some explanation for what I encountered. I've even gone back to those woods a few times, though never alone and never at night. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that mournful moan echoing through the trees. I'm an old man now, and I know most people would dismiss my story as the ramblings of a senile mind. But I know what I saw that night, and I know it was real. The memory of those glowing yellow eyes and those razor-sharp claws still haunts my dreams. Over the years, I've heard whispers of similar encounters in those woods. Hikers gone missing, campers fleeing in the middle of the night, locals warning outsiders to stay away after dark. It seems I'm not the only one who's crossed paths with the creature. I've often wondered about Frank, the old man who saved me that night. What did he know about the creature? How long had he been hunting it? I tried to find him again, years later, but his cabin was abandoned, reclaimed by the forest. The locals in Millfield claimed they'd never heard of him. Cooper lived to a ripe old age, but he was never quite the same after that night. He became more protective, more alert. Until the day he died, he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, growling at shadows only he could see. As for me, that experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I became more cautious, more aware of the thin veil that separates our orderly world from the unknown that lurks just beyond. I never went camping alone again, and to this day, the sound of rustling leaves in the dark is enough to make my heart race. I've tried to write about that night many times over the years, but the words never seem adequate. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? How do you convey the bone-deep terror of coming face to face with the impossible? Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I find myself listening for that moan. Part of me hopes I'll never hear it again, but another part almost wishes I would, because as terrifying as that encounter was, it was also exhilarating in a way. It was proof that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. I'm nearing the end of my life now, and I find myself thinking about that night more and more. Was the creature real, or was it some kind of shared hallucination brought on by fear and isolation? And if it was real, what was it? Some undiscovered species? A genetic experiment gone wrong? Or something older, something that has lurked in the shadows of human civilization since time immemorial? I don't suppose I'll ever know the answers to these questions, but I do know this. Those woods hold secrets, dark and ancient secrets that are perhaps best left undisturbed. And yet there's a part of me that wishes I could go back, just one more time, to stand in that clearing again, to feel the weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. Because for all the fear and trauma that night brought me, it also gave me something precious, a glimpse behind the curtain, a peek at the true nature of our world. And once you've seen that, well, you can never really go back to seeing the world the same way again. So if you find yourself in those woods someday, and you hear a moan on the wind or see yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our understanding. And whatever you do, don't go into the woods alone at night, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the darkness. As I sit here, pen in hand, trying to capture the essence of that night, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there? Is it roaming those woods even now, waiting for another unsuspecting camper to stumble into its territory? And if so, what will happen when our ever-expanding civilization finally encroaches too far into its domain? These are questions I'll likely take to my grave. But I've written this account in the hope that someday someone might find it and understand. Understand that the world is vast and mysterious, that there are things out there beyond our comprehension, and perhaps armed with this knowledge they'll be better prepared than I was if they ever find themselves face to face with the unknown. As for me, I've made my peace with what happened. I've lived a long life filled with joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures. But nothing in all my years has affected me as profoundly as that night in the woods. It opened my eyes to a world of possibilities, both wondrous and terrifying, and for that, despite the fear and the nightmares, I'm grateful. So as I close this account, I leave you with this final thought. The next time you're in the wilderness, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, don't dismiss it, because you never know. You might just be in the presence of something ancient, something primal, something that reminds us that we are not, and have never been alone in this world. And with that, I lay down my pen. The story is told, the memory preserved. What happens next is up to you, dear reader. Will you dismiss this as the ramblings of an old man? Or will you look at the world a little differently, a little more cautiously, knowing what might be out there in the shadows? The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, the unknown is always waiting, just beyond the light of your campfire. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you might just hear it calling your name. The diesel engine rumbled to life, a familiar sound that had become as comforting to me as a lullaby over the years. I, Frank Wilkes, 48 years old and weathered by 2 decades on the road, settled into the worn leather seat of my Peterbilt 379. The cab smelled of coffee, cigarettes, and the faint lingering scent of pine air freshener. My home away from home. It was 4:30 a.m., and the truck stop was just beginning to stir. A few other drivers milled about, loading up on caffeine and greasy breakfast sandwiches before hitting the road. I'd already done my pre-trip inspection, checked the load, and filed my paperwork. Now, it was time to roll. As I pulled out onto the interstate, the sky was just beginning to lighten, a faint pink glow on the horizon promising another scorching summer day. But for now, the air was cool, and the road was clear. Perfect driving conditions. I reached for my thermos, taking a long swig of black coffee. The bitter taste helped chase away the last remnants of sleep. I had a long haul ahead of me, 1,100 miles from upstate New York to a small town in South Carolina. The dispatch had been vague on the details, just gave me an address off Route 95 and a delivery window. "Get it there on time, Frank. Jerry," the dispatcher had said. "There's a bonus in it for you." Jerry wasn't one for small talk, which suited me just fine. In this business, you learn to appreciate people who get straight to the point. And a bonus? That was music to my ears. Things had been tight lately, fuel prices were through the roof, and the company wasn't as generous with covering expenses as they used to be. A little extra cash would go a long way. As the miles ticked by, my mind wandered to what I might do with that bonus. Maybe I'd finally take that trip out to Kansas to see my brother Tom. It had been too long since we'd caught up face to face. Maybe we could even catch a Royals game, just like we used to when we were kids. I thought about calling my daughter Lisa too. She was busy with her own life now. Married, 2 kids, a job in marketing or advertising or something. We didn't talk much these days. Not for lack of trying on my part, but, well, I guess that's just how things go sometimes. The sun climbed higher in the sky as I cruised down I-87. The lush green of the Adirondacks giving way to the more settled landscape of the Hudson Valley. Traffic picked up as I neared Albany, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I'd been doing this long enough to know every trick in the book when it came to navigating busy highways. By the time I hit Pennsylvania, the day was in full swing. The radio crackled with news updates and traffic reports, interspersed with country songs and the occasional trucker's warning about speed traps. I kept one ear on the CB, always alert for any hints of trouble up ahead. It was just past noon when I pulled into a truck stop outside Scranton. My stomach was growling, and I knew better than to push on without a proper meal. Truck stop food might not be gourmet, but it beats the hell out of trying to unwrap a sandwich while doing 70 on the interstate. The diner was busy, filled with the usual mix of truckers, families on road trips, and locals grabbing a quick bite. I slid into a booth near the window, giving me a clear view of my rig in the parking lot. Old habits die hard, and in this line of work you learn to keep an eye on your cargo. What'll it be, hon? The waitress, a middle-aged woman with dyed red hair and a name tag that read Doris, appeared at my table, pen poised over her notepad. "Meatloaf special and a coffee, please," I said, not bothering to look at the menu. You eat enough meals at places like this, you know what's safe to order. As I waited for my food, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about this run felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but after 20 years on the road, you develop a sixth sense for trouble. Maybe it was the vague instructions from dispatch, or the promise of a bonus for what seemed like a straightforward job. Or maybe I was just getting paranoid in my old age. I shook off the feeling as Doris returned with my plate. The meatloaf was dry, and the mashed potatoes came from a box, but it was hot and filling. As I ate, I overheard snippets of conversation from nearby tables. Most of it was the usual trucker talk, complaints about regulations, stories about close calls on the road, boasts about record times between cities. But one conversation caught my attention. Two guys, younger drivers by the look of them, were talking in low voices about a series of strange incidents along I-95. Third one this month. One of them was saying, "Always at night. Always at those isolated rest stops." "You believe that crap?" His friend scoffed. "Sounds like a ghost story to me. Something to scare the newbies." "I'm telling you, man. My cousin's buddy saw it himself," said the guy just appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road. Nearly ran him off trying to avoid him. I tried to listen in more closely, but Doris chose that moment to refill my coffee, drowning out their voices. By the time she moved on, the younger drivers had changed the subject, now arguing about the merits of different truck models. As I finished my meal and paid the bill, I found myself mulling over what I'd overheard. Strange incidents on I-95. It was probably nothing, just another tall tale making the rounds. The highways were full of urban legends and trucker folklore. Still, I couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Back in my rig, I did another quick walk around, checking the tires and making sure the load was secure. Everything looked good, but I double-checked the locks on the trailer anyway. Better safe than sorry, especially with the kind of stories I'd just heard. As I pulled back onto the interstate, the sun was already starting to dip towards the horizon. I had a long night of driving ahead of me if I wanted to make good time. The radio kept me company as the miles rolled by, but my mind kept drifting back to those younger truckers and their whispered conversation. What exactly was happening on I-95? And more importantly, was I driving straight into it? The sun had long since set by the time I crossed into Virginia. The highway stretched out before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt illuminated by my headlights and the occasional glow of passing cars. It was the kind of night that could lull you into a false sense of security if you weren't careful. The monotony of the road, the steady hum of the engine, the hypnotic flash of reflectors on the shoulder, it could all conspire to dull your senses if you let it. But I'd been doing this too long to fall into that trap. I kept my eyes moving, scanning the road ahead, checking my mirrors, staying alert for any sign of trouble. The coffee from the diner had worn off hours ago, replaced by a steady stream of energy drinks and the occasional splash of cold water on my face at rest stops. It was just past 2 a.m. when I hit a particularly lonely stretch of I-95. The traffic had thinned out to almost nothing, just the occasional set of headlights in my rearview mirror, quickly receding as I maintained my steady pace. The darkness pressed in on all sides, broken only by the dim glow of my dashboard instruments and the occasional silhouette of trees against the night sky. I was starting to feel the fatigue creeping in, my eyes growing heavy despite my best efforts to stay alert. I knew I needed to find a place to pull over soon, maybe grab a quick nap before pressing on, but the exits were few and far between on this stretch, and I was wary of stopping at just any old rest area, especially after what I'd overheard back at the diner. Just as I was considering pulling onto the shoulder for a quick breather, I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest stop. Last services for 50 miles, it warned. I figured this was as good a chance as any to refuel, both the truck and myself. As I took the exit, I immediately noticed how run down the place looked. The pavement was cracked and pitted, weeds growing up through the gaps. The lights in the parking area flickered erratically, casting weird shadows across the nearly empty lot. A single rusted-out pickup truck sat in the far corner, its windows dark. I pulled up to the fuel pump, the brakes hissing as I brought the rig to a stop. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft ping of my engine cooling down. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on loose gravel. The air was thick and humid, carrying the faint smell of diesel and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. As I started to fuel up, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure emerged from the shadows near the main building, and for a moment my heart rate spiked. But it was just a kid, couldn't have been more than 20, wearing a faded uniform and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Evening," I called out, trying to keep my voice casual. "You work here?" The kid nodded, not saying a word. He shuffled towards me, his movements oddly stiff, almost robotic. When he got closer, I could see his eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and waxy under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Coffee machine working?" I asked, more to break the uncomfortable silence than out of any real desire for more caffeine. He nodded again, jerking his thumb towards the building. "Inside," he mumbled, his voice flat and emotionless. I finished fueling up and headed inside, the bell above the door jangling discordantly as I entered. The interior was no better than the outside. Flickering lights, dirty floors, shelves half empty and disorganized. The coffee machine sat in the corner, looking like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. I poured myself a cup anyway, grimacing at the burnt smell. As I turned to pay, I noticed the kid had followed me inside. He stood behind the counter now, staring at me with those bloodshot eyes. "That'll be $3.50, he said, his voice still devoid of any emotion. I handed over a $5, telling him to keep the change. As he rang up the sale, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Drugs, maybe. It would explain the odd behavior. "Long night?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He didn't respond at first, just stared at me for a long moment. Then, just as I was about to give up and leave, he spoke. "Be careful out there," he said, his voice suddenly intense. "It's not safe." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he had already turned away, shuffling towards the back of the store. I left quickly after that, the bell jangling behind me as I stepped back into the humid night air. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. The kid's warning echoed in my mind, mixing with the stories I'd overheard earlier. I was just about to climb back into my cab when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the parking lot. At first, I thought it might be another driver, maybe someone stretching their legs. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized this was something else entirely. The figure was unnaturally tall, at least 6.5 feet, with broad shoulders that seemed too wide to be human. It wore dark clothes, a hoodie pulled low over its face, jeans, and heavy boots. But it was the stillness that really got to me. It didn't move, didn't shift its weight, didn't even seem to breathe. It just stood there, facing my truck as motionless as a statue. I felt my heart start to race, adrenaline flooding my system. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get in the truck and drive, to put as much distance between myself and this thing as possible. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the door handle of my truck. The moment my hand touched the cool metal, the figure's head snapped towards me. I couldn't see its face in the shadows of the hoodie, but I felt its gaze lock onto me with an almost physical force. That's when I saw the knife. It glinted in the flickering light of the fuel station, a long curved blade that the figure held with practiced ease. My blood ran cold as I realized the stories, the warnings, they were all true. I yanked the door open and practically dove into the cab, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start the engine. The whole time, I kept my eyes on the figure, watching as it began to move towards me with slow, purposeful strides. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. In my side mirror, I could see the figure standing where I had been parked, its head turned to follow my retreat. As I merged back onto I-95, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Who or what was that figure? What would have happened if I hadn't gotten away? I drove through the rest of the night in a state of hyper-alertness, jumping at every shadow, every set of headlights in my mirror. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. But I was alive. I had survived whatever it was back at that rest stop. As the miles rolled by and the day grew brighter, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a product of too many hours on the road and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there, something dangerous, and I had a sinking feeling that my encounter at the rest stop was only the beginning. The sun climbed higher in the sky as I pushed on, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I hadn't stopped since that encounter at the rest area, too wired and too scared to even consider pulling over again. But as the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion began to set in. My eyes felt gritty, and more than once I caught myself starting to drift. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. It was dangerous, not just for me, but for everyone else on the road. I needed to stop, to rest, to try and make sense of what had happened. But the thought of pulling into another rest area sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was just past noon when I spotted a sign for a truck stop ahead. Not just a rest area, but a proper truck stop with a diner, showers, and most importantly, other people. Safety in numbers, I told myself, even as another part of my brain whispered that it hadn't helped those other drivers who'd gone missing. I took the exit, my heart rate picking up as I navigated the access road. But as the truck stop came into view, I felt some of the tension leave my body. It was busy, with rigs of all sizes filling the parking lot and a steady stream of people moving in and out of the main building. This was familiar territory, the kind of place I'd stopped at hundreds of times over the years. I found a spot to park and shut off the engine, sitting for a moment in the sudden silence. Now that I'd stopped moving, the events of the night came crashing back over me. The rundown rest stop, the eerie attendant, and that thing in the parking lot. It all seemed like a bad dream in the bright light of day. But the fear had been real. The danger had been real. And I knew I couldn't just brush it off. I climbed down from the cab, my legs stiff from hours of driving. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and frying food, and the sound of idling engines created a constant background hum. I made my way towards the main building, my eyes darting around, half expecting to see that tall, dark figure lurking in the shadows. Inside, the diner was crowded and noisy, filled with the chatter of truckers and the clink of cutlery on plates. I found an empty booth near the back, sliding in with a groan as my tired muscles protested. A waitress, her name tag reading Marge, appeared almost immediately, coffee pot in hand. "Rough night, sugar?" she asked, filling my cup without waiting for a response. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "You could say that." Marge gave me a sympathetic look. "You want the usual trucker special?" "Yeah, thanks," I said, not even bothering to look at the menu. I knew it would be eggs, bacon, hash browns, the kind of hearty fare designed to fuel long hours on the road. As Marge walked away, I overheard snippets of conversation from the booth behind me. Two voices, both male, speaking in low, urgent tones. Third one this month. Always the same MO. "You think it's connected to what happened last year?" "Has to be. Too similar to be a coincidence." I found myself straining to hear more, but their voices dropped even lower, barely audible over the clatter of the diner. When Marge returned with my food, I decided to probe a little. "Say, Marge," I began, trying to keep my voice casual. "You hear about anything strange happening on I-95 lately?" Marge's face changed, her friendly smile faltering for just a moment. "Strange how?" she asked. her tone carefully neutral. I shrugged, playing it off. Oh, you know, just some stories I heard. Probably nothing. Marge glanced around, then leaned in closer. Listen, honey, she said, her voice low. I don't know what you've heard, but be careful out there, okay? Especially at night. Stick to the main roads. Stay with other trucks if you can. Before I could ask any more questions, she straightened up and moved on to the next table, leaving me with more questions than answers. I ate quickly, my appetite diminished by the growing sense of unease. As I was finishing up, the two men from the booth behind me got up to leave. One of them, a burly guy with a salt and pepper beard, paused by my table. Couldn't help it over here, he said, his voice gruff. You asking about I-95? I nodded, pushing my empty plate aside. Yeah, heard some stories. Thought they were just trucker tales, you know? The man glanced at his companion, then back to me. Meet us out back in 5 minutes if you want to know more, he said, then walked away without waiting for a response. I sat there for a moment, debating. On one hand, following two strangers behind a truck stop didn't seem like the smartest move. On the other, I needed answers, and these guys seemed to know something. In the end, curiosity won out. I paid my bill and made my way outside, circling around to the back of the building. The two men were waiting, standing next to a beat-up Ford pickup. Name's Bill, the bearded man said. This here's Mike. He jerked his thumb towards his companion, a younger guy with a nervous energy about him. Frank, I replied. So, what's this all about? Bill looked around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. You've seen something, haven't you, out there on 95? I hesitated, then nodded. Last night, some kind of figure at a rest stop. Didn't seem human. Mike let out a low whistle. You're lucky to be standing here, man. Not everyone who sees it lives to tell the tale. What exactly is it? I asked. Bill shook his head. We don't know. Not for sure. But it's been happening for months now. Truckers disappearing. Abandoned rigs found at rest stops. And always the same description from the few who've seen it and survived. Tall, I said. Unnaturally still. And that knife. Both men nodded grimly. That's the one, Bill confirmed. Listen, Frank. Whatever this thing is, it's dangerous. And it seems to be targeting truckers specifically. But why? I asked. What does it want? Mike shrugged. Your guess is as good as ours. But we've been tracking the incidents, trying to warn as many drivers as we can. Bill reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Here, he said, handing it to me. It's a list of the rest stops where incidents have been reported. Avoid them if you can, especially at night. I took the paper, my hand shaking slightly. Thanks, I said. I appreciate the warning. Just be careful out there, Bill said. And if you see anything else, anything at all, call the number on that paper. We're trying to gather as much information as we can. As I walked back to my truck, my mind was reeling. What I'd seen wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger, something that had been going on for months. And now I was caught up in the middle of it. I climbed into my cab, the list of dangerous rest stops clutched in my hand. My delivery deadline suddenly seemed a lot less important in the face of what I'd learned. But I couldn't just abandon my run. I had a job to do, and I needed the money. As I started the engine, I made a decision. I'd continue on to South Carolina, but I'd be a lot more careful about where and when I stopped. And once this run was over, I'd have some serious thinking to do about my future on the road. I pulled out of the truck stop, merging back onto I-95. The highway stretched out before me, familiar yet suddenly alien. As the miles rolled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the gathering darkness, something was watching, waiting. And I had a sinking feeling that my encounter with it was far from over. The rest of the day passed in a blur of highway miles, and paranoid glances at my rearview mirror. Every time I saw a figure by the roadside or a car pulled over on the shoulder, my heart would race, expecting to see that tall, dark silhouette. But each time, it was just an ordinary traveler or a state trooper doing their rounds. As night fell, the tension ratcheted up another notch. The list Bill had given me felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. I'd memorized the names of the rest stops to avoid, but that didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made the darkness outside my windows seem more menacing, full of unknown threats. I was about an hour north of the South Carolina border when my fuel gauge started creeping towards empty. I'd been pushing it, trying to avoid stopping, but I knew I couldn't make it to my destination without refueling. I scanned the upcoming exit signs, looking for a truck stop that wasn't on Bill's list. Finally, I spotted one that seemed safe, a well-lit pilot travel center just off the highway. I took the exit, my muscles tense as I navigated the access road. The travel center was busy, which I took as a good sign. Plenty of other trucks, a steady stream of cars at the gas pumps. Safety in numbers, I reminded myself. I pulled up to one of the diesel pumps and climbed down from the cab, my eyes darting around as I started to fuel up. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, the result of too little sleep and too much stress, but the feeling persisted. As I waited for the tank to fill, a car pulled up to the pump on the other side. A woman got out, mid-30s I'd guess, with long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She glanced my way and gave a polite nod, which I returned automatically. "Long haul?" she asked, gesturing to my rig. I nodded, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah, heading down to South Carolina." She smiled. "Same here. Well, not the long haul part. I'm just going to visit my sister in Charleston." I was about to respond when movement caught my eye. A figure was walking across the lot, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. For a moment, my heart stopped. But as the figure passed under a light, I saw it was just another trucker, heading towards the store. The woman must have noticed my reaction. "You okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. I forced a smile. "Yeah, sorry. Just tired, I guess. Playing tricks on my eyes." She nodded sympathetically. "I get that. I've done a few long drives myself. You be careful out there, okay? The roads can be dangerous at night." If only she knew, I thought. "Thanks," I said aloud. "You too." I finished fueling up and headed inside to pay and grab some coffee. The store was brightly lit and crowded, which helped ease my nerves a bit. I paid for my fuel and coffee, then headed back to my truck. As I approached my rig, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and unfolded it. In crude, jagged handwriting, it read, "I see you, Frank." I looked around wildly, my heart pounding in my chest. The lot was still busy, people coming and going, but none of them seemed to be paying any attention to me. How had someone known my name? How had they gotten to my truck without me noticing? And then a worse thought hit me. What if it wasn't a person at all? I climbed into my cab and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled out of the travel center, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The highway stretched out before me, dark and foreboding. I knew I should find a safe place to stop, to rest. But the note had shaken me to my core. I didn't feel safe stopping anywhere now. So I drove on into the night, my eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors, watching for any sign of pursuit. The miles ticked by, each one bringing me closer to my destination, but also deeper into what felt like a waking nightmare. As I crossed the South Carolina border, a new thought occurred to me. What if my destination wasn't safe? What if this whole job was some kind of setup? The vague instructions, the promise of a bonus, it all suddenly seemed suspicious. But I was committed now. I had a job to do, and I needed the money. All I could do was stay alert, stay cautious, and hope that I'd make it through this delivery in one piece. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I saw a sign for my exit coming up. This was it. The final stretch. Whatever was waiting for me at the end of this run. I was about to find out. I took the exit, following the GPS directions down a series of increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. The scenery changed from suburban sprawl to rural farmland, and finally to dense forest. The pavement gave way to gravel, and then to dirt. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only about 45 minutes, I saw it. A large metal gate set into a high fence with a sign that read, "Private Property, Deliveries Report to Guardhouse." I pulled up to the gate, my heart pounding. A guard emerged from the small building next to the gate, approaching my truck with a clipboard in hand. "Name and business?" he asked, his face impassive. "Frank Wilkes," I replied, my mouth dry. I have a delivery of farm equipment. The guard checked his clipboard, then nodded. We've been expecting you, Mr. Wilkes. Follow the road to the main complex. Someone will meet you there to handle the unloading. The gate swung open with a creak of metal, and I drove through, feeling like I was entering the lion's den. The road wound through dense forest for another mile before opening up into a large clearing. What I saw there made me gasp. It wasn't a farm. It wasn't anything I could have expected. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, futuristic-looking building, all gleaming metal and tinted glass. Surrounding it were what looked like military-grade security measures, armed guards, security cameras, even what appeared to be some kind of energy fence shimmer. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove towards the complex. This was no farm equipment delivery. I was in way over my head and I knew it. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I had to see this through. As I approached the main building, a group of men in dark suits emerged from a side entrance. They didn't look like farmers or warehouse workers. They looked like government agents, or maybe corporate security. My stomach churned with a mixture of fear and confusion. I brought the truck to a stop where they indicated and climbed down from the cab on shaky legs. One of the men, a tall, lean figure with close-cropped gray hair, stepped forward. "Mr. Wilkes," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Thank you for making this delivery. I'm Mr. Johnson. If you'll follow me, we can complete the paperwork and get you on your way." I wanted to run, to jump back in my truck and flee, but I knew I'd never make it past the gate, so I nodded, following Mr. Johnson towards the building. The other men fell in behind us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being escorted to my doom. Inside, the building was a maze of sterile white corridors and locked doors with keypad entries. We passed laboratories where I caught glimpses of complex equipment and people in hazmat suits. What kind of place was this? Finally, we entered a large office. Mr. Johnson sat behind the desk and gestured for me to take a seat opposite him. The other men remained standing, blocking the door. "Mr. Wilkes," Johnson began, "I imagine you have questions." I laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. "Yeah, you could say that. What is this place? What's really in my truck?" Johnson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's in your truck, Mr. Wilkes, is exactly what you were told, farm equipment. But not the kind you're thinking of." He pressed a button on his desk, and a large screen on the wall flickered to life. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was footage from a highway at night. A tall, dark figure stood in the middle of the road. The same figure I had seen at the rest stop. But as I watched, the figure changed. Its form shifted, limbs elongating, skin rippling. In a matter of seconds, it had transformed into a creature that looked like something out of a nightmare. All sharp angles and gleaming carapace. "What you encountered, Mr. Wilkes," Johnson said, his voice calm, "was not human. It's a being from elsewhere. We've been tracking its activities for months now." My mind reeled. "But what does this have to do with me? With my delivery?" Johnson leaned forward. "The farm equipment in your truck is actually highly specialized containment and research gear. We're going to capture this entity, study it. And you, Mr. Wilkes, have just delivered the final pieces we needed." I felt sick. So all those missing truckers, all those incidents, regrettable casualties, Johnson said, his tone matter-of-fact, but necessary for the greater good. This being represents technology beyond our wildest dreams. If we can harness its abilities, the possibilities are endless. I stood up, anger overriding my fear. "You've been using us as bait. Sending truckers out there, knowing what could happen." Johnson's eyes hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Wilkes. You're in no position to take the moral high ground. You've been part of this operation from the moment you accepted this job." As if on cue, one of the men behind me placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, forcing me back into my seat. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Johnson smiled again, and this time it was predatory. "Now, Mr. Wilkes, you have a choice to make. You can join us, be part of something world-changing." He let the alternative hang in the air, unspoken but clear. I looked around the room, at the impassive faces of the men surrounding me, at the nightmare creature frozen on the screen. I thought about all the truckers who had disappeared, about the terror I'd felt on the road, and I thought about what might happen if this entity, this technology, fell into the wrong hands. In that moment, I made my decision. I'm in, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. What do you need me to do? Johnson's smile widened. Excellent choice, Mr. Wilkes. We'll start by having you make another run, but this time you'll be carrying some very special cargo. As he began to outline the plan, I felt a part of myself withering away. I was no longer just Frank Wilkes, long-haul trucker. I was now complicit in something dark and dangerous, something that blurred the lines between science fiction and horror. But I was alive, and in this new world I'd stumbled into, that was no small thing. As I left the complex later that day, my truck loaded with equipment I didn't understand, and a mind burdened with knowledge I never wanted, I couldn't help but laugh at the bitter irony. I'd spent my life on the open road, cherishing the freedom it gave me. Now that same road had become my prison. I emerged onto I-95, heading north this time. The highway stretched out before me, familiar yet forever changed. And somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, I knew it was waiting, watching. The hunt was on, and this time, I was the hunter. But as the miles rolled by and the sun dipped below the horizon, a nagging question gnawed at the back of my mind. In this deadly game of cat and mouse, who was really the predator and who was the prey? Only time would tell. And out here on the long, dark highway, time was the one thing I had plenty of. The old man's eyes bored into mine, filled with a dark intensity. Beware, Ranger. There are things that walk these woods, ancient things. They look like men, but they are not of this world. The skinwalkers, those who walk like them but are not them. Do not go deep into the forest alone, especially not at night. I nodded politely at the wizened Native American elder, but in my head I dismissed his words as nothing more than old folklore and superstition. I had been a park ranger for over a decade, serving in forests and wilderness areas across the country, from the vast woods of Oregon and Pennsylvania to the remote reaches of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, the hills of North Carolina, and now here in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. In all my time, I had never seen anything to make me believe in the supernatural. The wilderness held many dangers, sure, but they were the natural kind. Extreme weather, treacherous terrain, wild animals. Nothing unnatural. Thank you for the warning, I told the old man. I'll be careful out there. Don't you worry. He shook his head. You do not understand, young one, but you will. Soon enough you will. With those ominous parting words, he turned and walked away, soon vanishing into the shadowy tree line at the edge of the ranger station. An involuntary shiver ran through me. There was something unsettling about the iron certainty in his voice. I shook it off. I had work to do. There had been reports of lost hikers in an isolated section of the forest. Probably nothing serious. This sort of thing happened from time to time with inexperienced backpackers, but it was my job to make sure they made it out safe. I gathered my pack and set off into the woods with my partner that day, Ethan. The midday sun slanted through the canopy of red and orange autumn leaves. Though beautiful, the thick foliage blocked out much of the light, lending an oddly twilight feel even at noon. The forest seemed to close in around us as we hiked. Did that old native guy say anything to you before we left? Ethan asked after we'd walked in silence for a while. He stopped me too. Mumbled something about skinwalkers and ancient evil rising before wandering off. Creepy stuff. You don't think he's all there mentally, do you? No telling, I replied. A lot of the elders cling pretty strongly to the old ways and beliefs. I wouldn't read too much into it. Let's just focus on finding those lost hikers before dark. But as we pushed deeper into the shadowy woods, a strange feeling of dread began to gather in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. Suddenly, the old man's dark warning didn't seem so crazy after all. The forest felt different somehow, as Ethan and I hiked onward, heavy and watchful, like it was holding its breath. The normal sounds of nature seemed strangely muted. No bird calls, no skittering of small animals in the underbrush. Even our footsteps made no sound on the carpet of dense pine needles. It was as if a hush had fallen over the entire wood. The very air seemed thick and oppressive, resistant to the passage of sound. I glanced over at Ethan. The wary look on his face told me I wasn't the only one unnerved by the strange atmosphere. He met my eyes and shook his head slightly, as if to say, I don't like this at all. I nodded in silent agreement. Something felt very off. After another hour of hiking, we reached the area where the hikers had last been seen. Ethan and I fanned out to search for any trace of them or clues to where they may have gone. As I scanned the forest floor, a glint of something metallic caught my eye. I walked over and crouched down for a closer look. It was a compass, the old-fashioned kind with a brass case and thick beveled lens. Strange. It looked decades old, not like something a modern hiker would carry. As I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, I noticed something else odd. The needle was spinning erratically, not pointing north at all. I tapped the glass, thinking perhaps it was just stuck, but it continued to whirl in crazy looping circles. A malfunction. With a shrug, I pocketed it to fiddle with later and resumed my search. "Jake, over here!" Ethan's shout echoed through the trees, pulse quickening. I rushed over to where he stood, examining the trunk of a huge old-growth oak. As I got closer, I saw what had alarmed him, a series of deep gashes in the bark, far too large and savage to be from any normal forest creature. They raked down the trunk, splintered wood visible beneath, as if something immensely powerful had clawed straight through the tough outer layers. "What the hell could have done this?" Ethan breathed. "Those marks are as wide as my hand." "No idea," I said grimly, "but I'm really starting to get a bad feeling about this." We spread out our search, looking for any other signs of the hikers, or whatever could have made those unnerving gashes. But though we scoured a half-mile radius around that damaged tree, we found nothing else out of the ordinary. It was like they had vanished into thin air. By that point, dusk was starting to gather. The meager light filtering through the leaves took on a reddish fading slant. Soon it would be fully dark, and temperatures could drop fast this time of year. If the hikers were still out there, unprepared to spend the night, hypothermia would be a real risk. Ethan and I exchanged a look. We both knew we should head back to the ranger station and gather a larger search party to continue at first light. But something in me resisted leaving, quite yet. Just then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the twilight, shattering the eerie silence. It sounded close and human. Ethan and I locked eyes for a split second, then took off running in the direction of the awful sound, crashing through the underbrush. Dread rose in my throat with the certainty that we were already too late, that we would not like what we found, as Ethan and I sprinted toward the source of the scream. Another sound reached my ears beneath the thudding of my pulse. A wet, crunching, tearing noise that turned my stomach. I put on a fresh burst of speed, leaping over a fallen log and whipping around a dense copse of trees, Ethan close on my heels. We burst into a small clearing and skidded to a stop, breath sawing. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of the scene in front of me. A figure crouched over a prone form in the center of the clearing, illuminated by the last coppery rays of fading sunlight. The figure's back was to me, but I could see its arms working in a jerky, savage motion. And the sounds. God, the sounds. Wet smacking, the crunch of bone, the tearing of flesh. A rank coppery scent hung in the air. "Hey," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure froze and slowly rose from its crouch, turning to face us. A shock of pure horror jolted through me. It had the shape of a man, but the face was a nightmare. Yellow eyes gleamed above a blood-smeared muzzle, razor fangs bared in a snarl. Gore dripped from its clawed hands. It was like no animal I had ever seen, but its features were horribly, grotesquely canine. A skinwalker. The old man's warning screamed through my mind. Those who walk like them but are not them. Beside me, I heard Ethan make a strangled sound of terror and disbelief. The creature zeroed in on the noise, its baleful yellow gaze shifting to us. Then it surged forward in a blur of motion. Time seemed to slow. I scrabbled for the bear spray on my belt, knowing it was useless even as I fumbled with the canister. The creature closed the distance between us in seconds, moving so fast my eyes could barely track it. I caught a flash of yawning jaws, a fetid breath that reeked of carrion. I braced for the feel of fangs rending my flesh. A deafening boom split the air beside my ear, as Ethan fired his sidearm point blank at the creature's face. It recoiled with a high yipping cry, black blood spraying from its head. Ethan fired again and again, the percussive shots echoing through the clearing. The skinwalker fell back, thrashing and snarling. Then, to my disbelief, it seemed to start changing, its proportions warping and shifting like hot wax, fur retracting, limbs realigning with hideous cracking sounds. In a few moments, a naked man lay panting on the forest floor, half his head a pulped ruin. He twitched once, twice, then went still, clouded eyes staring at nothing. In the ringing silence after the gunshots, Ethan and I stood over the gory remains of the skinwalker, not quite able to process what had just happened. The acrid scent of cordite mingled with the disturbing smells that hung in the small clearing. After a long, stunned moment, I forced my gaze away from the corpse to the crumpled form a few yards away that the creature had been crouched over moments before. Ice seemed to crystallize in my veins as details resolved in the fading light. The torn flesh, the awkward sprawl of limbs, the glassy and lifeless eyes. It had been human, once. Probably one of the hikers we had been searching for, before. I clamped down on the thought, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. I looked away, breathing hard through my nose and trying not to be sick. "Holy Christ," Ethan said hoarsely, holstering his gun with a hand that shook. "What was that thing?" He stared at me with wild eyes, as if he desperately wanted me to have an answer that would make some kind of sense. I could only shake my head mutely. The old man's words tolled in my mind like a demented bell. Those who walk like them but are not them. He had tried to warn me, but I hadn't listened. In a daze, I reached for my radio, intending to call this in, to bring backup, to make this the problem of someone above my pay grade. Static hissed from the speaker when I keyed the button. I fiddled with the dial, trying to clear the interference, but only staccato bursts of white noise answered me. I was about to give up when a voice crackled across the channel, broken up but unmistakable. It was the old Native American man. "Too late," he said, the signal wavering. Rising. "More will come. The harvest." Ice prickled down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "What do you know about this?" But the radio had fallen silent, not even static coming through now. I looked up at Ethan, seeing my own fear mirrored in his ashen face. One monster was dead. But if the old man was right, the horror was just beginning. We were standing at the edge of a nightmare that I sensed would get unimaginably worse before this night was through. "We need to head back," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Regroup, call for help. There's nothing more we can do here now." Ethan nodded shakily. We turned away from the bodies, from the pool of blackening blood soaking into the earth, and began heading back the way we had come at a stumbling run. Darkness swallowed the woods around us now, far more total than natural night, like a physical thing. I could barely see Ethan a few paces ahead. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, trunks loomed out of the black at the last second. At some point I realized I had dropped my useless radio, but I didn't dare stop. Panic was a living thing clawing at my throat. The old man's words chased themselves in my head. More will come. The harvest. What in God's name had he meant? Over the pulse pounding in my ears, I became aware of another sound, growing louder with each jolting step. A crashing, thrashing noise in the underbrush, in the dark spaces between the trees, as if something very large was moving through the forest around us. No, not something. Many things, many creatures. Circling, keeping pace, drawing ever closer. Just as that horrible realization sank in, Ethan cried out ahead of me. He had stopped short, and in the fractured moonlight breaking through the canopy, I saw why. Shapes emerged from the trees, ringing the clearing ahead, silhouettes becoming hideously solid and real as they stepped into the pale light. Wolves, far too many, and far too large, with glowing amber eyes and teeth that gleamed like bared knives. No, not wolves. Even in the dimness I could see their twisted proportions. The way they moved, the flat emptiness of their gazes. I stumbled to a halt behind Ethan. The things took a step forward, tightening their circle. A low snarling, horrifyingly eager, rose from a dozen bristling muzzles. I knew with numb certainty that I was looking at the old man's they. The skinwalkers. And we were surrounded. Terror turned my limbs to water as the skinwalkers stalked closer, lips peeling back from dagger-like teeth, feral eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence far beyond anything in nature. A sour, charnel reek washed over me, the stench of death and decay and something sharply chemical underneath. "Ethan," I croaked through a throat tight with fear. "Don't move," as if we could escape by standing still, as if these nightmares would lose interest and melt back into the shadows if we just froze like startled rabbits. But they kept advancing with a predatory intentness. I heard Ethan fumbling with his sidearm again. What good would it do, though, even if he could get off a shot or two before they fell on us? There were too many of them. What do we do? Ethan hissed desperately, pressing his back against mine as the monsters closed in from all sides. Oh God, what do we do? I had no answer for him, my mind a panicked blank. This wasn't covered in any of my training as a ranger. No park emergency protocols on how to survive being cornered by a pack of supernatural horrors wearing the skins of wolves. Just as the nearest one bunched its haunches to spring, a new sound rose above the snarling, the deep, bone-shaking rumble of a powerful engine. Headlights knifed through the darkness at the edge of the clearing. The skinwalkers swung their terrible heads toward the light with uncanny synchronicity, eyes flashing. A Humvee with Forest Service markings burst out of the trees, tearing up the underbrush. It plowed right into the circle of beasts, sending several flying with sickening thuds. The vehicle skidded to a stop, half-transformed bodies crumbling beneath its tires. A door was flung open. The old Native American man leaned out. "Get in," he roared. "Now." Ethan and I didn't hesitate, sprinting for the truck and diving through the open door. The remaining skinwalkers, thrown into confusion by the Humvee's sudden appearance, milled and snapped but didn't seem to know whether to lunge for us or get out of the way of the revving engine. The elder floored the accelerator, and we shot forward, tires spitting up leaves and loam. Something heavy thumped into the side of the vehicle as we burst out of the other side of the clearing, leaving the snarling pack behind. In the rearview mirror, I saw glowing eyes receding into the blackness. Panting, bruised, still half convinced I was in the midst of a nightmare from which I would surely wake at any moment. I turned to our unlikely savior. How did you find us?" I managed, slumping bonelessly against the seat. "No time," the old man said grimly, not taking his eyes off the narrow forest track we were hurtling down. "They won't stay confused for long. This is just the beginning." "Beginning of what?" Ethan demanded, alarm still threading his voice. "What the hell is happening?" The elder risked a glance over, ancient eyes glittering in the ghostly dashboard light. "I tried to warn you, Ranger. But now you're part of this, caught up in the harvest just beginning. The skinwalkers are rising, more every hour, and they did not awaken on their own. Then what woke them?" I heard myself ask as if from a great distance, icy dread pooling in my gut. The old man turned his gaze back to the rough road, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "Something far worse." We jolted along the rugged forest track in tense silence, the Humvee's headlights barely penetrating the unnatural gloom that choked the woods outside. My mind churned with the events of the last few hours, the mutilated hiker, the skinwalker attack, being cornered by the pack, and the old man's dire warning about an evil worse than the horrors we had already faced. It was too much to process. I turned to the elder, who was focused on navigating the treacherous terrain, his weathered features set in grim lines. "Who are you?" I asked. "How do you know about these things? And what did you mean about something worse waking them?" The old man glanced over, ancient eyes glinting in the dim light. "I am John Stillwater, an elder of the tribe native to these lands, and my people have long known of the dark forces that dwell in the deep woods. The skinwalkers are an old legend, those shamans who traded their humanity to walk as beasts. But they are not supposed to exist beyond myth in these modern times." "Then why are they here now?" Ethan asked hoarsely from the back seat, still pale and shell-shocked. "Because something has changed," John said grimly. "Some ancient evil is stirring that has not walked the earth in generations. It called to the skinwalkers, raising them from dormancy to be its foot soldiers again." A chill rippled through me at his words, but before I could ask what exactly he meant, the radio on the Humvee's dashboard crackled to life. Broken, panicked snippets of voices hissed through the static. "Overrun. Oh God. They're everywhere. Ranger station, calling for backup. No. Then just screaming and a wet, crunching sound I had come to recognize with sickening clarity. Silence fell. John Stillwell met my horrified gaze, his own eyes heavy with dread. "It has begun." He cranked the wheel hard to the left, tires grinding as we tore off the main track onto an overgrown trail I had never seen before, branches scraping the windshield. The Humvee lurched and bounced over the uneven ground. "Where are we going?" I shouted over the engine's roar. We have to get back to the ranger station. They're under attack. It's too late for them now, John said harshly. We cannot fight this evil unprepared, or it will claim us too. I'm taking you to the only place we may find answers and weapons to stand against the rising dark. Despair and confusion roiled in my gut, but I bit back further argument as the headlights flickered out and true darkness swallowed us whole. I could only pray John Stillwater knew what he was doing, and that it would somehow be enough to survive the long night ahead. The Humvee's engine sputtered and died just as the tires crunched to a halt on a bed of pine needles. For a moment we sat in eerie, watchful silence, the only sound our labored breathing and the ting of the cooling engine. Blackness pressed against the windows, thick and absolute. Finally, John Stillwater reached beneath his seat and pulled out a heavy-duty flashlight. The beam lanced through the murk, playing across the broad trunks of ancient hemlocks that rose on either side of the vehicle like the pillars of a primordial cathedral. Ahead, stone steps led up a steep embankment before disappearing into shadow. We walk from here, John said, shouldering open his door with a screech of hinges that sounded obscenely loud in the stillness. And stay close. The dark is not our only enemy tonight. Ethan and I exchanged a quick glance heavy with trepidation and unspoken questions. But there was nothing to do but follow the old man up those cracked stone steps, the flashlight throwing our elongated shadows ahead of us like a grim vanguard. The stairs seemed to go on forever, switchbacking sharply every dozen steps. The edges crumbled with age and half buried in leaf litter. My heart thudded against my ribs as we climbed, every rustle in the undergrowth making me twitch with the phantom sensation of eyes upon us. Just as my burning legs were about to give out, the steps ended abruptly at the weathered remains of a wrought iron gate, nearly invisible beneath strangling vines until John wrenched it open with a shriek of protesting metal. Beyond sprawled the weed-choked ruins of what looked like an abandoned church or monastery. Walls still standing, but the roof long ago collapsed. "What is this place?" I panted as we picked our way through the rubble of the nave, decaying pews scattered like broken teeth. "A sanctuary," John Stillwater replied cryptically. "One of the last bastions against the ancient dark. The priests who built it centuries ago knew more of what lurks in the shadows than most. There are wards here, old magics in wood and stone to keep evil at bay." He shone the light on a section of wall, the carved symbols thrown into stark relief, and making my head swim with their strangeness. I tore my gaze away. "So what do we do now?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. John set the flashlight on a chunk of fallen masonry, its glow turning his face into a mask of crevices and plains. "Now I teach you what I can of how to fight the skinwalkers and the power behind them," he said gravely, and then we turn back to face the rising dark before it consumes everything. The finality in his voice made me shiver despite myself. The horrors of the night already seemed to press against the crumbling walls of our meager refuge, growling and hungry. I looked at Ethan and saw my own sick fear mirrored back at me. But beneath it I saw the steel of resolve harden in his eyes, a glint to match the elder's grim determination. They were scared as I was, but ready to do what had to be done. We had to fight. For the rangers back at the station. For every innocent soul caught up in this nightmare. For the world itself. We had to make our stand, no matter the cost. I took a deep breath and turned back to John Stillwater. "Teach us," I said, my voice hard. "Teach us how to kill these things." Something like approval flickered across his weathered face. Then he began to speak, low and urgent, as the darkness gathered outside and time ticked ever closer to humanity's last reckoning. "The skinwalkers are just the beginning," John Stillwater said, as he hastily laid out an array of objects on a stained altar cloth, bundles of dried herbs, stone fetishes carved with alien runes, wicked-looking obsidian blades, foot soldiers for the greater evil. To stop them, we must strike at the power controlling them. "And what exactly is that?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. The elder hesitated, as if wrestling with whether to put a name to the unnameable. "The Navajo call it Yeyetso, the great evil way. Your tongue has no word for it. An ancient, hungry intelligence from beyond the veil of flesh and reason, old as life itself. Sometimes, when the signs align, cracks open in the walls of the world, and IT pushes through to feed and sow chaos." I didn't know how to process the sick unreality of what he was saying, so I reached for the practical. "But, if it's so powerful, how do we fight it?" I gestured at the arcane items. With this, Stillwater shook his head. This is mere ritual, to arm and prepare our minds against its influence. But to truly strike at Ydiso, we must cut the cords anchoring it to our world. He met my gaze, eyes hard and fathomless. We must destroy the skinwalkers. All of them. As long as they walk, it has a conduit to manifest through. I nodded slowly, the scale of the task settling like a leaden weight in my chest. How many are there? I asked, voice a dry rasp. Dozens, hundreds perhaps, called from hibernation in ancient caves and lightless pits. Already the forest crawls with their corrupt presence. Hundreds. Ice coursed through my veins at the thought of the handful we had faced. Even armed with Stillwater's strange wards and rituals, what chance did we stand against a throng of those horrors? We can't do this alone, Ethan said, voicing my own rising desperation. We need backup, reinforcements. What about the military? The old man just looked at him, something almost like pity etching his features. Who would believe? Would come in time if they did. No, this fight belongs to us now. The border wardens caught between worlds. It has always been so. He turned back, lifting something from the altar. It was a small leather pouch, stained and furred with age, on a beaded lanyard. He pressed it into my hands. It was warm, almost thrumming against my skin. Carry this close, John Stillwater murmured. It is strong medicine, a charm of protection. When the time comes, when you must make your stand, open it. You will know what to do. I wanted to ask more, to demand clearer guidance than riddles and cryptic trinkets. But time had run out. An eerie, undulating howl split the air outside, rising quickly to a frenzied chorus. The hunting song of the skinwalkers, more chilling than any normal wolf pack cry. They had found us. We were out of time. John Stillwater drew himself up, a steely calm settling over him. He pressed an obsidian blade into each of our hands, the edges viciously sharp. This is the work, he said simply. Strike true, cut the cords, end this before it ends us all. Then he strode toward the church doors, throwing them wide with a boom that rang with terrible finality. Beyond, eyes glowed in the shrouding dark, dozens, hundreds, more teeth than I could count. The old man glanced back at us, something almost peaceful in his face. Go, he shouted. I clutched the leather pouch, the knife a cold weight in my fist. We went. Dawn crept in shades of gray and crimson over a still forest, light seeping slowly across a floor carpeted in fog, and the dark shapes of bodies that lay as if sleeping. So many bodies. I sat on the crumbling church steps. Ethan slumped beside me. Both of us were spattered in gore, the sticky redness already rusting to brown. The obsidian knives lay at our feet, edges chipped, points blunted. They had done their work. Around us, the butchered remains of the skinwalkers lay in tangled heaps, some fully beast in death, others caught between forms in a parody of humanity. Beyond the churned soil of our battleground, an almost preternatural stillness had settled over the woods, an exhausted, mournful quiet. The night had been an endless blur of tooth and claw, of pain and desperation, the ragged bite of my own breath. Time and time again, the skinwalkers had pressed their attack, trying to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Yet somehow, against all odds, we had held the line. The obsidian blades had cleaved corrupt flesh like radiant truth through shadow. And when I had finally opened the medicine pouch in the last throes of the battle, it had erupted with a light so pure it seared the eyes, driving the beasts back in shuddering revulsion. But victory, if it could be called that, had come at a terrible cost. I had a flash of memory, fragmented and unreal. John Stillwater, ringed by snarling monsters, chanting words that made the air hum as he carved strange signs in the air with bleeding hands. A final, desperate invocation. Then a concussive force, a shockwave that sent Ethan and I tumbling, and the skinwalkers, caught at the epicenter, convulsing as if stabbed with 1,000 invisible blades, shredding apart until nothing remained. Nothing but the old man's broken body amid the settling ash, a faint smile still on his face. The great evil way had been turned back, the cords cut. But John Stillwater had paid the ultimate price to make it so. I looked over at Ethan, saw my own numb sorrow and disbelief etched in his eyes. The 1,000-yard stare of a man who has seen the impossible and terrifying, who had touched, however briefly, the strange and the deranged hidden at the edges of the map, and would never be the same. We were alive, but an innocence had died this night. An illusion of a world without monsters and magic, bled out in the sodden leaves. I hauled myself to my feet, joints screaming, and held out a hand to my fellow survivor, my brother in nightmare. Ethan clasped it, and I pulled him up into a rough embrace, just two humans clinging together against the immensity of a dark and uncaring universe. After a long moment, we stepped apart, gazed out at the abattoir the forest had become. So many questions, so much still unknown. We were stumbling blind in this wider world of myth and shadow. But one thing I knew for certain, as I bent to retrieve the medicine pouch with hands that still shook. It wasn't over. The skinwalkers were destroyed. But that older evil still lurked beyond the veil, patient and eternal. And next time we might not have an old medicine man to stand against it. Next time it might fall to us alone. I clutched the pouch like a talisman, like a promise. We would learn, as John Stillwater had, arm ourselves with old wisdom and new caution. And we would be ready, Ethan and I, the next time the harvest came. We had to be, for all our sakes. I took a deep breath, and together we walked into the blood-drenched dawn of a darker world.